From a very early age, Madame told her daughter that one day she would definitely introduce her to her uncle. He was her treasure, her only younger brother, the brightest person of them all. Aika, as if enchanted, absorbed every word her mother said about her brother. Aika shuddered when she heard her uncle once remark that the old man must have gone completely crazy to dare ask him for such a thing. He looked at her intently, almost scrutinizingly, and, calling out to her, called her by his affectionate nickname, Nut. She didn't hesitate and immediately objected, firmly and even a little offendedly, declaring that she was not a nut at all. He was interestedly going through nicknames for her: humorous, affectionate, downright strange. Aika only grew gloomier with each new option. She couldn't believe that her only brother, whom her mother always spoke of with warmth and reverence, turned out to be a terrible person. Now, in front of Aika, stood a completely different uncle, Cassel de Legier, than the one she had dreamed of. Cassel coldly, without a hint of embarrassment, asked if Aika understood that they would have to live under the same roof. Cassel noted that he had never been involved in raising children. Cassel, without blinking, added another rule: harsh, cold, spoken as if he were talking about a servant and not a niece. Aika looked up and froze. In the semi-darkness of the room, Cassel looked even more stern. He looked at her intently, as if he wanted to hear the answer. But looking away, she declared that she understood everything. Cassel briefly said that since everything was clear, he should go eat and disappear from his sight. Aika was puzzled when she reported that she had already eaten. He remarked that if she did not eat properly, she would forever remain a nut. The lady watched him for a while. Because she knew he was very angry, she sighed heavily, as she understood that she had no choice, and she had to live next to him. She had a beautiful, sonorous name, Aika de Valliart. To her regret, she left behind her loving grandfather, to live with her uncle, who couldn't stand her. At the same time, she had a good reason to stay by his side and not retreat even a step. After all, Aika, having gathered all her fragile courage into a fist, firmly decided to save her uncle from imminent death. She understood that her uncle was not himself, because he could not understand her heart. She lived in a large country called Wofford, where wars had been fought for centuries. But now the families had united with the emperor and stood up for his defense. The history of the House of Valliart is short, but they were said to be the most famous. Illud de Valliart was a great man who served several generations of rulers. Her uncle was the strongest swordsman. Aika's mother, Syria de Valliart, was the chancellor of Wofford herself. In her memories, her mother seemed like an eternal prisoner of palace service, endlessly busy, hardly knowing any days off. Aika did not know her father, but her mother once told her that he was destined to accomplish great feats. Just when Aika believed that life could be calm and happy even without her father, an unexpected incident occurred that shattered her illusion of security. Aika looked out of the carriage and called her mother, as she had promised to read to her. Syria looked at her daughter with a tender smile and said that she would soon join her. Syria asked her daughter what had happened, because she was usually patient, but today, strangely, she did not leave her side for a single step. After some thought, the young lady said that she felt as if she missed her mother very much. She was embarrassed by her daughter's statement. Unfortunately for them, they were driving calmly and did not suspect anything, while mercenaries were already waiting for them. After some time, the carriage began to shake violently, and they were informed that an ambush awaited them. The knights prepared to defend them, but unfortunately, there were more mercenaries. The man asked his partner if he had found the necklace. He stated that he had found the object, but the stone was not there. Then the man said that they had to return before the storm hit. Looking at his assistant, he told him to hide and look for the stone. Meanwhile, the young lady looked at her mother in horror and called her name, desperately trying to get her attention. Syria tried to calm her daughter down and convince her not to scream, trying to remain calm despite the danger. Syria, looking at her daughter, asked her to swallow a small stone to hide her scream and not reveal her presence. Before the lady could utter a word, her mother quickly placed a small stone in her mouth. She sighed heavily and, hugging her daughter, asked for forgiveness for not being able to protect her. Syria quietly told her daughter that she had special eyes. Syria asked her daughter to ignore anything she might see or learn, explaining that it would help save the people she loved. She also asked her daughter not to reveal this secret to anyone. Aika agreed, and at the same time asked her mother not to get sick. The series praised her daughter with a gentle smile, and also stated that she must fulfill her promise. When she opened her eyes, her mother was already gone. She was told that she was found not in the carriage with her mother, but in the forest nearby. All her memories after what happened were mixed up, although she knew that the palace was conducting an investigation. But she didn't know the details, and only knew that the emperor was beside himself with rage. She knew that the emperor was an old friend of her mother, so he was very angry. She knew that her mother was intelligent and responsible, so the emperor was extremely saddened by her loss. She cried a lot that day, and then she met her uncle for the first time. Aika rushed to her uncle, suddenly calling him mother. With tears in her eyes, Aika screamed and called for her mother. Seeing her uncle with the same hair and eye color as her mother, she decided that her mother had returned to their life. She clung to her uncle, whom she barely knew, and did not let go for long minutes. After this incident, she had to live with her grandfather, and it was then that she realized what her mother meant. Ike gained the ability to sense danger threatening others in advance. She gained the ability to foresee. At first, she saw the future in her dreams, but later, the visions began to appear even when she was awake. Having become accustomed to this ability, she learned to cross accidents with maids whom she really liked. But one quiet evening, she had a terrible dream about Nova. She saw a man who was furious with rage because he could not forgive the young man for something. He drew his blade in fury and attacked the young man. She woke up gripped by a terrible nightmare where her uncle was caught off guard. Aika was in shock, unable to understand who attacked her uncle. Aika was puzzled, but she understood that she was able to fix everything. Now, knowing the future, she could not remain an observer from the sidelines. The next day, she went to her uncle in a hurry. The young lady knew she had to stay close and protect her uncle for the sake of her mother's memory. Zenda's gaze lingered on the lady's face for a moment, and then asked softly if she needed anything else. Aika immediately asked the maid if she knew where her uncle was. The maid said that he had to go for a walk, and now, probably, he was in the dressing room. Aika! Her eyes wide, asked in a barely audible voice if this was really true. Aika jumped up and hastily said that she would drop in to see her uncle for a moment. The maid was dumbfounded. Zenda tried to stop her, asking if it wouldn't be better to have at least a little snack first. But Aika stubbornly shook her head and refused. She did not fall for the treat, and after much persuasion, the maid finally gave in, and they went to Cassel. After some time, the young lady knocked on her uncle's door with a joyful smile. But to her regret, no one answered her. Then she began to knock persistently and call her uncle, and the maid was shocked by her actions. Castle came out almost instantly. A menacing look fell on the girl. Her appearance disturbed his peace. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to see her uncle in such a state. But a moment later, she smiled and invited him to play at being his mother's daughter. He looked at her with bewilderment, as he did not understand why he would play such a game. Then, without a second's hesitation, she grabbed his leg and had no intention of letting him go. Cassel looked at the girl as if standing before him was not his niece, but some kind of mystery that could not exist in his world. He shook his leg awkwardly, trying to shake the girl off as if she were an annoying nuisance and not his own blood. With a mixture of irritation and confusion, he muttered that she was stubborn, just like her mother. Aika looked frantically at her uncle and declared that she would give him all the goodies, just so he wouldn't leave. Then Cassel asked with a grin whether she really thought that doll-like eyes would stop him. He screamed at her to let go before he threw her, but the young lady had no intention of doing such a thing. Castle could not resist and looked at her menacingly, but she only purred her answer with tears in her eyes. Aika understood that if he left, she would suffer greatly, snatched away with the man from her dream. One day, she secretly overheard a conversation between her uncle and grandfather. She learned that her uncle was eliminating people who did not get along with their family one by one. In other words, her uncle now had a huge number of enemies. She understood that if she didn't hold on to Cassel now, he would leave just as her mother had left. Forever. At that very moment, she remembered her mother, who was smiling at her with a radiant smile, and was stunned. With tears in her eyes, she told her uncle that she missed her mother. He was taken aback, as he realized that in front of him was just a little girl. Castle came closer to her, and said that in that case, she could just look in the mirror. She looked at him in bewilderment, and at that very moment, she declared that she was not at all like her mother. It seemed to her that her uncle was more like her. She said with a smile that they were very similar. Castle sighed heavily, because he did not know why she came into his life and sat on his neck. Aika asked if he hated her because she was a thorn. He was shocked and did not understand who told her that. Then she asked if he really loved her and wanted to live together. Cassel waved it off and said that he neither loved nor hated her. Aika said that she really liked him, and her mother told her a lot about him, so she wanted to be close to him. She looked at him intently and said that she really hoped he liked her. The young lady asked if she could stay close to Cassel, trying not to disturb him. He froze for a moment, stunned, seeing his sister's reflection in the girl. Cassel called his sister softly and warmly, and the girl only looked at him in bewilderment in response. As he left, he made it clear that she was allowed to act as she saw fit, but if she interfered with him, the consequences would be dire. At that very moment, the young lady blossomed before our eyes, as she was glad to hear it. Aika was happy and asked if it was true that he allowed her to stay. Cassel stated that it was so. She handed him a small contract and demanded that he put his finger on it, which greatly surprised Cassel. He sighed, confirming that she was his sister's daughter, and left, promising to put an imprint later. Aika asked if he would leave, but he said that he would stay and just ride his horse in the garden. Aika remembered her mother's words about writing down all the good things and decided to document everything. But as soon as she took a step, numbness gripped her body. She again saw a vision in reality. Her uncle was sitting on a horse, and next to him was a suspicious man. Cassel didn't have time to react before the horse rebelled, and he fell to the ground with a crash. Aika was confused and didn't understand what had happened. But a moment later, she realized that her uncle was in danger. She was terrified that something dangerous would happen, while her uncle slowly walked towards the stable, just like in her vision. Without wasting a minute, the young lady rushed to her uncle, but upon entering the office, she collided with the butler. The butler looked at the lady with puzzlement, not understanding the reason for her haste. The lady was dumbfounded, realizing that the gentleman had already gone out for a horse ride. She rushed to her uncle, exhausted in her search for the stables, not understanding why he was always in such a hurry. But after a few minutes, she finally saw her uncle. Aika called her uncle in a hurry, and he looked around in bewilderment, not expecting her to appear. She ran to him filled with anger, because she knew that he was a liar, because he himself said that he would not go anywhere. Cassel noted with bewilderment that he had not lied. He had gone for a ride in the garden, but was shocked that Aika had clung to him. She shouted that he couldn't ride that horse, and he looked at her in bewilderment, not understanding what she was talking about. At that very moment, Cassel took his niece in his arms and looked with bewilderment at the horse, which was worried about something. At the same time, the young lady stated that horses usually did not lift their hooves. Aika approached the horse, as she assumed that his hoof hurt, and she reached out to him. Cassel quickly snatched his niece from the horse, explaining that it was extremely dangerous, but the young lady was stunned by his abruptness. At that very moment, he turned to the man and asked him to examine the horse. Aika asked her uncle if he would ride a horse. He said that he would not do this because the horse was sick. The young lady beamed with happiness as she realized that her uncle would not be harmed. She breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that she had managed to save her uncle. Cassel looked at his niece with bewilderment and asked why she was so happy. He understood that if she had stayed with her grandfather, she would have grown up like a delicate flower in a greenhouse, and he could not understand why she decided to expose herself to danger by living with him. For this reason, he wanted to send her back to her grandfather. Moments later, Cassel brought her into the room and put her to bed. Cassel saw that she quickly fell asleep, but he didn't understand why she continued to cling to him. Then he froze in place in surprise, as his niece grabbed him by the sleeve and muttered in her sleep, asking him not to leave. He sighed heavily as he realized he needed to do something quickly before he got attached to her. A few days later, the young lady looked into her uncle's office. The knight greeted the lady with a joyful smile, while Cassel watched with indignation as his niece came to him again. Cassel asked the girl why she wasn't sitting in her room. Aika smiled and showed a drawing of her and Cassel. Cassel was taken aback when he noticed that the drawing actually depicted him, and Aika smiled and praised her work, assuring him that it turned out very well. A moment later, he declared that it didn't matter and demanded that Aika get ready immediately. She looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding what he was talking about. He stated that they were going to her grandfather's estate. The young lady immediately blossomed and began to jump for joy. She also asked her uncle if she could prepare a gift for her grandfather. He sighed, but agreed with her. After some time, the young lady got ready with a contented smile, as she was glad to meet her grandfather. After some time, She rushed towards her grandfather with a joyful smile. The man greeted his granddaughter with the same joyful smile, since they had not seen each other for a long time. She hugged her grandfather with a smile and admitted she'd missed him. He reciprocated her joy. Kassel, standing to the side, watched the scene with indignation. Kassel asked his father if he took care of his hair. The man loudly claimed that his hair was the same color as his granddaughter's, although in fact his hair was dyed, and the natural color was different. Ilid looked at his granddaughter with a smile and asked if it was true. She replied that it was, and they laughed joyfully. Kassel looked at the family reunion with puzzlement for a while. The young lady handed the gift to her grandfather with a smile, and the man was delighted. After some time, the young lady sighed heavily as her next snack was finished. The maid smiled and offered the lady some juice. Aika happily agreed and thanked the maid. Then, Ayeka turned to the maid and asked when her grandfather and uncle would come to her. Marie was taken aback, confused, and not knowing what to answer the young lady. Marie smiled and said with a slight hint of mystery that they were discussing something important. She sat there for a while, lost in thought, but a moment later she heard the sound of a carriage driving away. At that very moment, the young lady realized something important. Without wasting a minute, she jumped up and ran, which shocked the maid. Aika ran to the balcony railing and froze for a moment. She saw her grandfather standing next to the carriage. Then she looked at her uncle, who was sitting in the carriage, and did not understand why he was there, since they had just arrived and had not even had time to eat. At that moment, she realized the bitter truth. He was going to leave her. Ilid turned around instantly upon hearing his granddaughter's voice and was stunned. Ilid quickly grabbed his granddaughter and warned her that she could get hurt if she ran like that. But Aika, with tears in her eyes, stubbornly demanded that he let her go. She watched the carriage drive away, calling for her uncle. At the same time, she was confused. He was really leaving, and she just wanted to save him. Aika screamed frantically and begged him not to leave. But she understood that it was all in vain. Sometime later, Ilid looked at his granddaughter with bewilderment, as she did not want to talk to him. Aika turned around and looked menacingly at her grandfather, without saying a word. The man was confused and didn't know how to react, because he had never seen such an expression on her face before. With tears in her eyes, she said that she would have caught up with her uncle if her grandfather had not interfered. He tried to calm her down and offered her something to eat, while at the same time asking if she didn't want to live with him. Aika was shocked. Her uncle had actually abandoned her, although he had previously promised not to do so. She understood how cruel it was on his part to force her to give up all attempts to save him. The butler, looking at the gentleman, stated that several days had already passed since the young lady's departure, and the estate had become lonely. Kassel declared that he liked silence, but the butler understood that only his master liked someone like her. A moment later, a knight entered his office and announced that a man from the duchy had arrived with notice about the young lady. Kassel, taken aback, asked the knight what the young man had conveyed. Gerard reported that on the first night, the girl fell asleep with tears in her eyes and was now completely depressed, hardly eating and waiting for her uncle all the time. He asked the gentleman if he wanted to visit his niece. Kassel sighed heavily, but did not answer, realizing that this state would not last long. He only noted that she was just a child, and everything would be fine soon. He looked menacingly at his subordinates and ordered them to return to work, and they obeyed with bewilderment. Kassel thought for a moment about his young niece. He remembered her radiant smile and happiness when she ate sweets. He sighed heavily and realized that he had to meet her. But at the same time, he reproached himself for being too attached. He realized that he had to cut off all ties with her, and then she would not cry, shedding bitter tears. Then the young man threw all his thoughts away and made some very important decisions for himself. After some time, he hurried his horse, as he only wanted to catch a glimpse of his niece's face. He was worried, knowing she hadn't eaten, but he knew there was no point in entering through the main gate and making a scene, so he decided to jump over the fence. Kassel remembered that his niece slept in the room where his sister used to live. But a moment later, he heard some noise, and looking around, he noticed mercenaries. The men communicated with each other because they already knew where their target was, and therefore they wanted to split up. A moment later, the man was taken aback as he heard someone's unfamiliar voice. He froze in shock when he felt the sharp balls behind him. Kassel looked menacingly at the mercenary, as he did not expect anything like this. At that moment, he asked with a grin whether they really had the nerve to attack his house. He angrily declared that they should expect consequences for their actions, so without wasting a moment, he grabbed the man by the throat. He looked at the man with fury and asked who was behind the assassination attempt, but his opponent could not utter a word. Cassel, without waiting for an answer, was taken aback as he realized that someone had approached him from behind. A moment later, he turned around and saw his father pointing his sword at him. The Duke asked his son what was going on, and Cassel replied that they were under attack. A moment later, he realized that his niece was in danger. He rushed towards the house, telling his father that he had left mercenaries behind to protect him. He ran into the room and at the same time really hoped that she was sleeping peacefully in bed. Looking at the bed, he breathed a sigh of relief as he realized that she was sleeping quietly, unaware of anything. But at that very moment, he realized that something was wrong and hastened to open the blanket. Cassel stood frozen in shock, seeing only toys in the bed and his niece nowhere to be seen. Eika was sleeping quietly in her bed, but suddenly she felt as if something was heavily squeezing her chest. Opening her eyes, she froze in complete numbness. A huge snake was lying on her. The girl's body trembled with horror. She had never seen anything like it before, and a cold fear entwined her stronger than the snake itself. The snake slowly raised its head and opened its mouth, preparing to devour its victim. At that moment, the young lady realized with horror that she was in mortal danger. A moment later, Eika suddenly opened her eyes and realized that she was lying in her bed. Her heart was pounding wildly. This was not just a dream, it was an omen. And then a loud, sharp sound was heard from outside, as if something heavy had fallen to the ground. Syria told her daughter that sometimes scary shadows come, and then you need to hide. Aika listened carefully because the shadows could appear again. Syria smiled and said that they could practice playing hide-and-seek beforehand so that the girl wouldn't be afraid of the shadows that appeared. Then the young lady realized that the same shadows that came to her when she was with her mother had come to her. She hid in the hope that her grandfather would save her. But the steps were getting closer and closer, and fear seized her. She had been found. With tears in her eyes, she held her breath and cried out to her family. But at that very moment, she was taken aback when she heard her uncle's voice, who was swearing, not understanding where his niece was. Trembling with fear, she quietly called out to her uncle, and his presence made her heart skip a beat. He instantly rushed to the closet, and Aika looked out, causing him to freeze in bewilderment. How could she have ended up in such a dangerous place? For a few moments, she sat motionless, paralyzed by fear and surprise, not believing that her uncle had actually come for her. Finally, she rushed towards him, tears rolling down her cheeks, and inside she was filled with fear, followed by relief. With tears in her eyes, she asked her uncle if the shadows had gone away and if her hiding was over, while expressing how much she missed him, and he tried to calm her down. He looked at her in surprise, not realizing that she was playing hide-and-seek again. Eika, with tears in her eyes, remained true to her habit. During hide-and-seek games, she always hid in the closet, as her mother taught her. Cassel was truly shocked and could not understand what his niece was doing. Eika looked at her uncle with tears in her eyes, hoping that he would take her with him, because he had previously promised never to leave her. Looking away, he explained that he had not abandoned her, but only left her for a while. But she, overcome with anger, considered it one and the same. Eika burst into bitter tears, begging him not to leave, wanting to stay close. He sighed heavily, realizing that he had no other choice. A moment later, he admitted that words were at a loss, and she looked at him with bewilderment. Looking at his niece, Cassel assured her that he would not leave her and that she could get some sleep. But the young lady no longer believed him and considered him a deceiver. Eika told her uncle that he should sit quietly on the bed. He looked at her in bewilderment, not understanding what she was doing at all. Then the young lady tied their wrists and ordered that they go to bed and return home tomorrow. He was shocked, but could not object. The next day, the Duke entered the room and was momentarily taken aback by what he saw. He sighed heavily, realizing that this could not be avoided, and at the same time, he was perplexed why his son was playing the prude. Early in the morning, Cassel told his father that he was taking his niece to live with him. The Duke looked intently at his son, and with a menacing expression, declared that if even one hair fell from his granddaughter, he would strip him of his title. Then, he turned his attention to his granddaughter and said that he would miss her very much, but the young lady assured him that she would come to see him often. Castle asked his father if he had caught all the uninvited guests. The Duke declared that he had dealt with them completely. Then he became furious and declared that they would pay with their own blood for underestimating their family. The young man received his father's words with joy. Then he approached his niece, who was happily saying goodbye to her grandfather. After some time, everyone in the duchy wore small ribbons on their chests. Cassel looked at the servants in bewilderment, not understanding the strange expression on their faces, because they all looked as if they were enchanted. A moment later, a young lady ran up to them and greeted them with a smile, asking if they had arrived without incident. Cassel smiled and said that he had behaved well. Gerard smiled and greeted the young lady and asked how he could help her. Eka smiled and said that she had something for him, after which she took out a small gift for the knight from her pocket. He looked at her with embarrassment and asked if she had prepared something like this herself. Ika smiled and suggested pinning the gift to her clothes. Eka added, with a gentle smile, that she had prayed to the flower to bring him happiness and thanked the knight for always protecting her. The young man was touched by her words and sheepishly promised to take care of the gift. Cassel looked at them in bewilderment, not understanding what had been happening since early morning, but thought that his niece was not involved at all. The knight said with a smile that she could now give the gift to her uncle, but the young lady declared that she would not bother them anymore and quickly said goodbye. Cassel froze in place, amazed, because he did not expect such a thing from her, and was puzzled by the fact that she gave gifts to everyone except him. After some time, the young lady looked at the elegant dessert with shining eyes and could not understand what kind of miracle appeared before her. The lady, with a warm smile, explained what dessert she had prepared, especially for the young lady, and said that it was her small gift. They chatted pleasantly for a while Cassel watched his niece attentively and almost suspiciously. Finally, Cassel couldn't take it anymore and declared that they were making too much noise, asking the chef to calm down. Sophie smiled awkwardly and apologized. Cassel looked intently at his niece and asked with cold seriousness if she had forgotten anything important. Eka responded with surprise that she didn't seem to have forgotten anything and calmly continued to enjoy her dessert. But a moment later, her eyes flashed, as if she suddenly remembered something important. At that very moment, she reached into her pocket and said shyly that she wanted to ask her uncle for a favor. A second later, she handed him a small package, which completely took him by surprise. With a smile, she explained that the letter had her name on it, so she took it from her uncle's desk and asked him to accompany her to the imperial palace. Cassel frowned and asked if she knew the emperor, and Aika replied that she didn't personally, but he was a friend of her mother. Cassel looked away from her with a stern gaze and said briefly that he was not going to accompany her, which greatly stunned the girl. She asked in confusion why he didn't want to go, and then he coldly noticed that his chest was empty. Aika was completely confused and looked at him with wide eyes, not understanding what he was talking about. Then he waved his hand, said that it didn't matter, and told her to finish everything to the last crumb, after which he left. Aika looked after him in confusion, and Sophia sighed heavily and quietly noted that their master turned out to be terribly touchy. Aika thought about it and realized that getting into the palace without her uncle would be much more difficult. Gerard watched his master carefully, noticing how offended he was because he had not received the brooch. The knight could not believe that the kind and generous young lady could forget about her own uncle. But soon they entered the office and noticed a small box with a beautiful sign on the table. Gerard smiled and said that it seemed the young lady had left the gentleman a gift after all, but had just saved the most special one for him. Cassel asked his knight in surprise why he had put on this ribbon, since it seemed too simple and inconspicuous to him. But in his heart, he was still glad that he too had received such a gift. Cassel narrowed his eyes suspiciously and asked if the knight had also found a gift in the box. Gerard shook his head and calmly replied that everything was different. Then Gerard smiled and declared that the young lady had made such a gift only for him, because she loved her uncle more than anything in the world. Cassel only grinned and told his comrade to stop flattering and get down to business. But in his heart, he was pleased and even a little more cheerful. A moment later, Gerard reported that the inspection of the fragments of equipment of the people who attacked the ducal estate was finally completed. The report revealed that all of the attackers had committed suicide, leaving no traces or answers behind. Cassel sighed heavily and ordered that his niece be told to begin preparing for her visit to the imperial palace. Gerard was surprised, because just recently the gentleman had categorically refused to take her to the palace, but now he had clearly changed his mind. The next day, the young lady, with a beaming smile, asked her uncle if she looked beautiful in her outfit, but a moment later, she noticed that he was wearing her brooch and happily praised him, because the decoration matched his clothes perfectly. However, as always, he pretended not to hear her words and only hurried her, which again puzzled the girl. Suddenly, the man stopped, as if he remembered something important, and turned to her. He came closer and carefully placed a small name tag around her neck, which greatly embarrassed his young niece. After some time, the young lady walked slowly along the road to the palace, but her mood had noticeably worsened. She complained to her uncle that people around her were looking at her too closely and asked if she could take off the pendant. Castle sighed and sternly said that he couldn't film her and that she shouldn't create any unnecessary problems. Aika quietly replied that she felt awkward, but promised to behave calmly and not cause any trouble. After some time, they sat in the living room of the palace and silently waited for the emperor to appear. Finally, the emperor entered, apologized for being late, and looking at the girl, asked with curiosity if she really was Aika. Aika froze for a moment, because in front of her stood the emperor, who seemed to her the most beautiful man in the world. She remembered her mother's words that she should always know the emperor's name, because it was a sign of respect and wisdom. Her mother told her that purple eyes were an ancient symbol of royalty. The girl froze for a moment, noticing his thick black hair, dark and deep, like the night sky. Aika was confused, because she herself had exactly the same black hair. She thought about it, remembering her mother's lessons where she was told that the emperor also had black hair, and she became curious about how rare it was. But suddenly, the young lady gasped quietly at an unexpected thought, and the emperor looked at her in surprise. Having come to her senses, Aika quickly got ready and, according to all the rules of etiquette, politely introduced herself. The emperor smiled softly, seeing the well-behaved girl before him, and said that he was glad to meet her. Then he suddenly dropped to his knees and asked if she would let him hug her. Aika opened her arms wide with a joyful smile, inviting him into a hug. The emperor responded with a warm smile and hugged her carefully, as if trying to convey his warmth and kindness. He looked at her carefully and said that he didn't even expect her to be so tall. With a slight smile, he admitted that he had been waiting for their meeting for a very long time. The emperor sincerely thanked the girl for coming to his palace. He also noticed that she looked remarkably like her mother. Aika smiled and asked curiously if it was true that he was friends with her mother. He nodded and said that it was true, because her mother and her uncle were his dear friends. The emperor noticed the necklace on her neck and asked with a smile if her uncle had given it to her, adding that it was very nice. Aika was embarrassed because she did not expect such a compliment. She quietly admitted that her uncle had simply told her to wear it, and the emperor smiled again and said that the decoration suited her very well. Without wasting any time, the girl said that she had also prepared a gift for him. The emperor was slightly surprised, but waited patiently and with interest to see what she would show. Aika handed him the gift and with a sincere smile thanked him for the invitation to the palace. Winchester was noticeably surprised and even a little embarrassed, because he was rarely given such warm gifts. Meanwhile, Castle stepped forward and showed his brooch with a satisfied smile, because it was even a little better. Castle, with a satisfied smile and almost without words, hinted to the emperor that his gift looked much more luxurious and significant. Winchester smiled softly and sincerely thanked the young lady for her touching gift. He admitted that among the many gifts, this one turned out to be the most special and promised to keep it carefully. Hearing this, the young lady was sincerely happy because the emperor liked her gift. Then, Winchester said that since he received a gift, he was obliged to give her something in return. With a slight smile, he called his assistant over and ordered him to present the young lady with a small gift. Aika looked at the small box in surprise, not imagining what could be hidden inside. The emperor said that her mother had long asked him to convey this when the right moment came. He added that her mother considered her daughter very smart and was sure that this gift would be useful to her. A moment later, the emperor solemnly handed the girl the key to the imperial archive. Aika froze in amazement and then felt a wave of happiness and quietly asked if this was true, her mother's request. The emperor confirmed this and said that the archives contained ancient books and secret knowledge. He added that her mother believed that one day the girl would find something truly important there. With a kind smile, he allowed her to come to the archives anytime she wanted. Aika was incredibly happy because it seemed as if the gift came straight from her mother. She pressed the key tightly to her chest, as if she felt a warm maternal presence through it. Coming to her senses, the girl realized that she should thank the emperor for such an honor. She thanked him sincerely, but the emperor added with a smile that she could visit not only the archive. He said that he would be glad to see her at his place, and Aika agreed with a joyful smile. The emperor watched her closely, but at that moment, an assistant quietly approached him. He quickly whispered something in his ear, and Winchester looked thoughtfully at the guests. He announced that a man had just arrived at the palace whom he would like to introduce them to. The emperor said that this was his nephew, about the same age as the young lady. He noted with a smile that he hoped the children would be able to become friends. Hearing this, Aika immediately perked up, and her eyes lit up with joy. The emperor warned that the boy might seem a little reserved, but in reality, he was very kind. So he asked the young lady to be patient and friendly with him. Aika froze for a moment, because it was the first time she saw someone her age. She couldn't take her eyes off the boy, because he was truly beautiful, like the soft light of the moon. Ruspe extended his hand to her with a warm smile, introduced himself, and asked with interest what her name was. Several years ago, a boy was walking through the garden, and, with childish joy, was picking bright flowers, dreaming of giving them to his father. Clutching the bouquet in his small hands, he hurried into the house, hoping to see a smile on his father's face. But at the door of the study, he heard the irritated voices of his relatives discussing the emperor's stubbornness. They indignantly said that the ruler refused to marry, which meant that the throne still had no heir. Some quietly hinted that Ruspe could become the next heir, but that this would not solve all the problems. Not understanding the meaning of their words, the boy timidly opened the door and entered the office. Inside, he saw the cold gaze of the duke and the stern figure of the duchess. The duke looked sharply at his son and coldly noted that he had not even knocked. Then he asked in a stern voice what had brought the boy to his office. Rusp lowered his eyes in embarrassment and quietly apologized for his awkwardness. But the duchess immediately flared up with anger, noticing that the boy was covered in dirt. She angrily declared that it was not fitting for a potential heir to the throne to look like a garden child. With disdain, she ordered the dirty weeds he was holding in his hands to be thrown away, and without waiting for an answer, she abruptly snatched the bouquet and threw it on the floor. Flowers scattered across the carpet, and the boy stood frozen in place, dumbfounded. He declared that he no longer intended to indulge his naive, childish whims. Coming closer, the duke sternly pronounced the boy's name and forced him to raise his head. He said that Rusp was obliged to behave worthy of his high status. The duke then ordered him to go immediately to the imperial palace with the young duke for training. In a stern tone, he added that the boy must prepare for a great future. Coming very close, the duke quietly but heavily uttered the terrible words. If the emperor does not have an heir, it will be Ruspe who will one day take the imperial throne. Hearing this, the boy turned pale and clasped his hands in confusion. Aika said her name with a warm smile, trying to look brave, although her heart was beating excitedly. The young man bowed politely and greeted her, saying that the emperor had already told her a lot about her. The emperor looked at the children with a kind smile and noticed that they were almost the same age. He confidently added that he was sure that they would definitely become good friends. But a moment later, his face became serious, because state affairs were already calling him. With a sigh, the emperor stood up, realizing that he had to get back to work. Before leaving, he told the children that they could play in the palace garden. Then he turned to his friend and reminded them that they should meet at the next meeting. Already at the exit, the emperor looked at the young lady again and smiled warmly. He asked Aika to be careful and not get into trouble, and then, with a slight smile, invited her to visit the palace again. Cassel looked sternly at the children, declaring that they were not allowed to play in the garden, and Aika blinked in surprise, thinking that her uncle would play with them. He muttered coldly that he had no business being among the nuts, and Aika made a cheeky face, promising that he would come running back later anyway. With shining eyes, she grabbed her new friend by the hand and happily declared that it was time to forget the adults and play just the two of them. Aika cheerfully asked what to do, going through the games one after another. But the boy calmly said that none of this interested him. Aika froze, looking at him with bewilderment. How could such a cheerful friend suddenly become so cold and strange? He turned away and calmly declared that children's games did not appeal to him at all. As if a cold wind had passed between them, the girl froze for a moment. Her heart sank in shock, because such words sounded sharp and unexpected, like a lightning strike. Aika was confused and thought that her friend had completely changed, and a strange feeling of anxiety and bewilderment flared up inside her. Aika sorted through the games, trying to choose something more difficult and more mature, her eyes shining with curiosity. A moment later, she smiled at her friend and happily announced that she had come up with a special activity for the two of them. The girl handed him several bright flowers and asked hopefully if he liked such gifts. Unpleasant memories surfaced. He remembered how the Duchess had rudely thrown the dirty weeds out of his hands. Ruspe turned around and said coldly that he was not interested in flowers. Aika blinked in surprise, because adults also loved beauty. He pushed her away slightly and said that it was better to leave him alone, since there were no adults around and friendship was not necessary. Aika, not losing hope, smiled happily and said that perhaps he just hated flowers. Ruspe looked down, his eyes glistening with tears. He didn't understand what she was talking about. His heart sank. He hesitated and began to mumble something, and Aika cautiously asked if maybe he did like the flowers a little after all. The girl rushed forward and shouted for him to wait, beaming with excitement and determination. Rusp looked after her with bewilderment, not understanding her impulse, believing that he did not need friends. But everything changed when he saw her radiant face, full of happiness, and for a moment his thoughts disappeared. Without wasting a second, Aika held out her palms and asked if he liked her little gift. She said she had prepared a flower ring in honor of their friendship, and he sighed and repeated that he didn't need friends. He added that friendship was only needed by children, and the young lady noted with surprise that he himself was still a child. Aika said with a smile that her uncle had said that children like them only needed to eat and play. Then she declared that everything else was the adult's concern. Her gaze warm and sincere, she admitted that she wanted to be friends with him, share flower rings, and spend time together. The young lady asked him with a smile if he would be her friend, her heart beating fast. Rusp froze, his face flushed with embarrassment. He was confused and did not know what to answer her. Aika, with a beaming smile, handed him a delicate ring and asked if he would accept it. He was taken aback, not knowing what to do, but after a moment he took the ring and wondered if it was possible to make a friend. His father came to mind, threateningly declaring that he would not indulge his whims. Ruspe realized that he didn't really need friendship, but emotions overwhelmed him, and he burst into tears. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment, not understanding why he suddenly started crying. She asked if he didn't like the ring, then apologized, saying that friendship wasn't necessary. He wiped away his tears with a trembling hand and declared that it was not so, his eyes shining. With a smile, he thanked Aika and said that he also wanted to be friends with her. Then he extended his hand and invited her to become friends, his heart beating faster. A moment later, they were chatting pleasantly, smiles shining on their faces, but the conversation suddenly ended. Aika felt uneasy, and a shudder ran through her body. Ruspe, frightened, rushed to his friend, trying to understand what had happened to her. He wrapped her in his jacket and suggested going to the marquise. She gratefully accepted his help. A strange tremor ran through her body, reminding her of the first time she had seen the future. They didn't notice that a man was watching them from afar with a satisfied grin. He was delighted to see how the girl was winning the trust of the imperial family. Then the Duke turned to the adjutant and sternly stated that it was time for them to return. After some time, they returned to the estate, and Aika was very sad, because she wanted to spend more time with her first friend. She looked closely at the beautiful flowers he had given her, and a smile brightened the sadness a little. As they said goodbye, the young lady promised that they would soon meet again at the palace, but this would be in a few days. She delayed him for a moment, as she wanted to give her friend a parting gift. Aika handed over a handful of her favorite candies as a little surprise. Ruspe was surprised by the generosity, and pleasantly surprised that Aika gave away her favorite sweets. She said goodbye to him, but he asked her to stay, because he also wanted to give her a gift. Ruspe came closer and gave her flowers, saying that they reminded him of her. Aika was embarrassed, but thanked him with a smile and promised to take care of the flowers. The girl was a little puzzled, because if she hadn't frozen, they could have played longer. Suddenly, she felt a sharp cold that made her heart tremble. Meanwhile, Ruspe was returning home with an escort, not taking his eyes off the sweets. Kame smiled and advised me to put the candies in my backpack, but Ruspe insisted that he would carry them himself. The man was surprised, because the young gentleman usually did not like sweets, but now he ate them with pleasure. The next day, Aika ran to her uncle with a joyful smile, without even changing her clothes. Kassel looked at his niece with bewilderment, not understanding her constant unexpected appearances, since she came when he was changing clothes. Aika called out to her uncle and said that she urgently wanted to ask him something. She looked at him intently and asked if the emperor was friends with her mother, since they had the same hair. The Marquis said with bewilderment that she should get straight to the point. Embarrassed, Aika looked away and admitted that she wanted to know something. She asked if the emperor was married, which greatly surprised the Marquise. The girl asked whether it was possible that the emperor had a child. Aika wanted to know a lot of things because the emperor was so close to her mother. Kassel looked at his niece in surprise and asked why such strange and unexpected questions had suddenly occurred to her. He added that the emperor had never been married and dryly asked why she cared about such things at all. Aika flushed with indignation and asked heatedly whether she really couldn't even find out about such things. Then she looked intently at her uncle and almost pleadingly asked him to tell her the whole truth. The Marquis sighed heavily and coldly replied that the emperor was not married, which meant it was time for her to leave. But the stubborn girl immediately asked why then the emperor never married. Then the young lady asked with genuine curiosity whether the emperor really had that one and only, like in the fairy tales. The Marquis sighed heavily and replied dryly that such a thing was almost impossible, and she shouldn't think about it. Aika, her eyes shining, immediately asked who his beloved was then, but a moment later there was no answer. The office door slammed sharply in her face. Aika froze in complete shock, because her uncle, being a friend of the emperor, did not tell her anything, and this seemed very rude to her. While getting ready for important business, the Marquise began to think. His niece had been acting very strangely lately. He was used to her pranks, but now she became quieter than water and suspiciously calm. Aika asked where he was going, but he dryly replied that it was none of her business and ordered her not to follow him. To his surprise, the girl immediately agreed and didn't even ask to be taken with him. This seemed extremely suspicious and strange to him. The Marquis announced that he was leaving, and Aika, with a smile, wished him a successful trip. As he left, he looked at her intently, because her strange calmness was disturbing him more and more. One thought was spinning in his head. What was she planning this time? It was the first big ball since his sister's death, and he sighed heavily, realizing that his father had finally decided to go ahead with it. Looking at his knight, he calmly asked him to convey the very report they had spoken about earlier. The young man began to read, but his thoughts were confused. He suddenly wanted to check on his niece. He was sure that the girl had been asleep for a long time, but suddenly he noticed a suspiciously large chest in the carriage. With a heavy sigh, he ordered the young lady to get out immediately, and when there was no answer, he repeated the order menacingly. A moment later, the lid opened, and Aika awkwardly climbed out of the chest. She smiled cheerfully and asked her uncle with curiosity how he knew she was hiding there. He didn't answer, only asked when she got inside and became angry when he heard that she just jumped in. The Marquis was truly angry, but he finally resigned himself, and the girl asked hopefully if she could go. Aika joyfully ran up and hugged her uncle tightly because she was sure that he was the best. The girl smiled quietly while her uncle fixed her hair and happily asked if they were going to her grandfather's party. After some time, they arrived at the estate, and she looked with delight at the palace shining with lights. Aika chatted animatedly with her uncle, but he sternly warned her not to go far. Aika recalled how her mother used to dress up beautifully in the evenings and go to such balls with a warm smile. The girl asked if her grandfather had arrived before everyone else, but Kassel dryly replied that he didn't know and didn't care. A moment later, Aika entered the huge hall and froze, as if enchanted, looking at the elegant guests. But soon she became confused, because the people around her were looking at her too intently and strangely. The guests whispered among themselves, not believing their eyes. The Marquis rarely appeared at such celebrations. Soon all eyes turned to the girl next to him, and Aika was confused, feeling a strange anger in their eyes. Suddenly she felt ill. A chill ran through her body, her heart began to beat faster, and anxiety squeezed her chest. At that moment, a man approached them and greeted the Marquise with a mocking smile. The Marquis asked in surprise if there was any reason why he shouldn't appear at family celebrations. The man smiled softly and said that he was glad to see him alive after all the hardships he had gone through. Aika trembled with fear because the symbol on his cane seemed frighteningly familiar to her. Once upon a time, Madame showed her daughter a book with the coats of arms of noble families and patiently explained which sign belonged to whom. She was sure that her smart daughter would easily remember all the symbols and one day immediately recognize them. The Deslin family was adorned with an elegant snake, cold and insidious, and the Rondo family's symbol was a heavy ancient turtle. Aika remembered her mother's words and became frightened, realizing that this man could be their enemy, and she wanted to run away. But suddenly, she was overcome with calm. Her uncle hugged her tightly, as if protecting her from the whole world. Kaysel looked at the Marquis with fury and sharply declared that with age, his absurd suspicions had only grown stronger. The Marquis flushed with anger, but restrained himself and was unable to answer the young man. Before them stood the Marquis Jamil de Rondo, heir to the proud and dangerous house of Rondo, and his cold smile made their hearts clench with apprehension. Aika cowered in fear. Marquis Rondo stood in front of her, and her mother warned her to stay away from him, because he was friends with the treacherous Deslin. Castle looked coldly at the man and stated that it was time for them to go, suggesting that he enjoy the banquet in peace. The Marquis asked in surprise why there was such a rush, and noticed a child nearby, whom he had not seen before. He reached out to the girl, realizing that in front of him was the very same Aika about whom so many rumors had circulated. But Cassel abruptly grabbed his hand and did not allow him to touch his niece. He angrily warned the Marquis that if he continued to talk, he would be in serious trouble. Cassel coldly advised him to leave while he was still in a peaceful mood. The Marquis was momentarily confused, but quickly put on a polite smile. He said he didn't mean anything bad and just wanted to say hello to the girl. With a slight bow, he added that now, it seemed, was not the best time to get acquainted. After these words, the man quickly said goodbye and disappeared among the guests. After some time, Aika finally came to her senses and suddenly noticed her beloved grandfather. Her face immediately lit up with joy, and she ran towards him as fast as she could. A moment later, they were hugging each other tightly, laughing and greeting each other joyfully. Aika looked at her grandfather with a warm smile and quietly asked if she had ever met Marquis Rondo when she was still very little. The Duke froze in surprise, because he did not understand why his granddaughter suddenly started talking about the Marquis. The girl sighed and admitted that the old man's voice seemed familiar to her, as if she had heard it before. Cassel casually remarked that she probably simply confused his voice with someone else's, but Aika stubbornly shook her head and quietly said that she felt that something was completely wrong here. She then admitted that her mother had warned her to be careful around Rondo and Deslin's houses, and that had made her anxious. Cassel was taken aback, because he had not expected at all that his sister would tell her daughter such things. After all, Aika had previously diligently studied the coats of arms of all the noble houses with her mother and remembered them well. The Marquis sighed heavily, realizing that his sister had managed to reveal too much to the girl. Then the Duke decided to distract his granddaughter, and with a warm smile said that he had prepared a gift for her. He told her that he was building a large academy where she could study when she got a little older, and with a kind smile, he promised that one day they would definitely go there together. Cassel turned to his father with a slight smile, hinting at the worthless school, and deep down, he knew that the moment was opportune to press on Balian's weaknesses. For a while, father and son calmly discussed the academy, while the young lady next to them watched their serious conversation with confusion. The Duke warmly invited his granddaughter to come and see the construction of the academy one day, even allowing her to symbolically lay one brick. The young lady perked up, and with genuine delight decided that such a trip could be a real adventure for her. A moment later, the girl joyfully shared the news of her new friend with her grandfather, barely hiding the sparkle in her eyes. She also mentioned a meeting in 10 days at the Imperial Palace, and excitedly hoped to introduce them to each other. The Marquis dryly made it clear to his niece that this idea should be abandoned, since both he and her grandfather had too much to do. After a while, the young lady looked at her uncle in amazement, feeling that his words sounded unexpected and strange. She knew that almost no one had dared to approach him before, and so she was amazed by his sudden popularity. But the girl was still tormented by bewilderment, because her uncle seemed to coldly ignore all this attention. A moment later, she decided to approach the Marquise and greeted him with a polite smile. Hela noted with a slight smile that it was a great rarity to see the Marquis in such company. He sternly demanded an explanation, and the Countess hinted at important information and the consequences of refusing to listen to it. Meanwhile, Eika watched her uncle and the mysterious beauty next to him with admiration. At that very moment, her gaze became attentive and tenacious, as if she had turned into a quiet observer. Now their conversation seemed to her much more significant and mysterious than before. The Marquis soon informed his niece that he would be away for a short time, and the girl was genuinely happy about this. Eika quickly moved away, not wanting to disturb her uncle and his companion, guessing that he also had feelings. So she quickly walked towards her knight and greeted him with a lively, sincere smile. The girl cautiously asked if the young lady was her uncle's lover. Gerard smiled softly and made it clear that between them there was only a common goal and path, and not a romantic attachment. After some time, the girl was distracted from her thoughts by noticing a shining and amazingly beautiful fountain. Gerard invited the lady to sit down next to the murmuring water, and she happily accepted this invitation. A moment later, she was already sitting next to him, watching the streams of water with a quiet, happy smile. The girl sighed heavily, thinking how wonderful it would be if her uncle could also see this beauty. There was a slight sadness and anticipation of the meeting in her voice, and Gerard confidently promised to hurry the gentleman. After some time, the young lady sat quietly at the table, enjoying delicious treats. She didn't notice anything around her, but one of the ladies was already watching her, because Aika's sudden appearance in the Marquise's house irritated many. She waited patiently for her knight for some time, but a lingering boredom slowly crept up on her, and the idea of going on a search arose on its own. Suddenly, unpleasant words about her mother reached her ears, and a chill of anxiety instantly ran through her heart. Several gentlemen were curiously discussing the fact that her mother was not married and allegedly hid her daughter out of shame. They also discussed whether the Marquis was planning to marry, since it seemed strange to them to shelter a girl in his house. The young people assured each other with mocking ease that for a single man, the appearance of such a child looked very suspicious. One young lady remarked with a cold smile that if we were talking about a Marquis, then such a shortcoming could be forgiven. Aika froze in silent shock, because she did not expect to hear such cruel words. A rage flared up inside her because her mother was never ashamed of her daughter and always spoke of her with pride. The young man mockingly reasoned that if the Marquis had really intended to make the girl his heir, then a loud announcement would have been made long ago. The lady, with a cold smile, claimed that the girl was not even recognized by the family and grew up on the sidelines, so the chance of becoming an heir seemed negligible to her. The conversation became increasingly sarcastic, and they easily discussed her mother and relatives, as if the fates of others were just an excuse for boring fun. Eika couldn't stand it any longer and approached them, declaring with trembling determination that her mother had never hidden her daughter. The young people looked at each other in confusion, not expecting that the quiet girl would suddenly dare to intervene in their conversation. Burning with resentment, she furiously called their words a lie, feeling her heart beat faster and faster. The young lady flared up with anger, because the girl's insolence seemed to her offensive and completely unacceptable. Eika shouted with desperate determination that her mother had always been proud of her daughter and had never allowed anyone to doubt it. The angry lady cut her off abruptly, raining down harsh words on the girl and arrogantly demanding that she remember her place. She shouted with irritation that it was precisely because of such a hindrance that the Marquis had to listen to humiliating gossip. In a rage, the lady grabbed the glass with the drink and decided to teach the impudent girl a lesson with a humiliating act. A moment later, Aika opened her eyes in confusion, not understanding what had happened around her. Her gaze met her uncle, who silently shielded her with his body, taking the blow for her. The young lady turned pale with horror, realizing her mistake, and looked at the Marquis with trembling eyes. He stood straight and looked at them coldly. Although his clothes were stained with the spilled drink, Gerard quickly ran up to the young lady and anxiously made sure that she was all right. Cassel sternly ordered his subordinate to immediately take the child away from this scene. The young lady trembled with fear, not understanding how long the Marquis had been nearby and whether he had heard the entire conversation. She vaguely remembered that once the Marquis even shared a glass of champagne with her because she considered herself special to him. However, his gaze became cold and heavy, and he demanded that the girl finish her words. He mockingly hinted that her tongue had recently been much bolder and expected a continuation of such bold speech. The girl stood there at a loss, shocked by the rudeness with which the Marquis had allowed himself to speak to her, while Cassel was seething with anger, having heard disgusting words about his niece. So he coldly remarked that some people should watch their own condition before they spoke slander so carelessly. The young people cried out in shock and tried to understand the meaning of his words, but the Marquis only proudly left them. After some time, he was surprised to notice his niece on the cold street and did not understand why she was standing there. His gaze turned sharply to the knight, who was supposed to be watching the child. Gerard sighed heavily and humbly, prepared to accept any punishment, but the young lady quickly stood up to defend the knight, assuring him that he was not guilty of anything. Then Aika remembered her mother's words about how people who hurt others without reason live in their own hell. With a gentle smile, she suggested that her uncle forgive those young people this time. The Marquis was momentarily at a loss, for in that smile, he unexpectedly saw the features of his sister. He sighed heavily, looked away, and reluctantly agreed to do as his niece asked. Aika smiled brightly and thought with timid hope that perhaps her strict uncle already liked her a little. After some time, Aika thanked her uncle with a beaming smile for going with her, filling her steps with a light joy. He was surprised by her delight, because she was happy with a simple walk to buy a gift for a friend. In a burst of energy, she bombarded her uncle with questions and talked about her favorite flower shop, where she used to go with her mother. The girl, with genuine curiosity, said that she had never been to the market and asked if they could look at other places. The Marquis sighed heavily, repeating that they were simply going for flowers and nothing more. Aika looked at her uncle with light tears in her eyes, because she dreamed of going to the market and seeing the bright world around her. But with a quiet sigh, she said it must be a lot of fun there. Imagining the bustling rows and colorful goods, she shared memories of dolls and sweets, and the Marquis, unable to resist her face, finally agreed. A moment later, they arrived, and the girl joyfully jumped out of the carriage, while the Marquis loudly reminded her to be careful. Entering the store, Aika surprised the young saleswoman, who did not expect to meet an old acquaintance. The girl smiled broadly, greeted her, and asked with interest how she was feeling. Harry, with tears in her eyes, quickly hugged the young lady, her heart filled with relief and concern. She admitted that she was happy to see the girl safe, despite all the worries of recent days. Harry was puzzled by the young lady's fear and loneliness, and sighed heavily. She said regretfully that if she had known how everything would turn out, she would not have allowed the girl to leave with her mother, which greatly embarrassed Aika. A moment later, the Marquis entered the stall and looked at them sadly, adding a slight sense of unease to the atmosphere. Aika looked at Harry with a disappointed expression, trying to figure out if she knew about her mother's accident. Harry, wiping away tears, admitted that the day before the accident, the girl's mother came to see her and bought flowers. The saleswoman still remembered her warm smile, like a ray of light among difficult memories. But still, Harry was sincerely happy to meet the girl, because she had missed her very much all this time. Aika was deeply touched by these words, and her heart filled with quiet gratitude. A moment later, the saleswoman, with a gentle smile, invited her old acquaintance to move on and asked who the flowers were for. Aika happily listed what she wanted to give flowers to her new friend, grandfather, uncle, Gerard, and even the maid. The Marquis sighed heavily and declared that he didn't need flowers at all, which caused the girl's sincere indignation. Aika fervently assured him that the flowers were very beautiful, and he simply had to appreciate them. Harry smiled cheerfully and remarked that their shop had the most beautiful flowers in the entire area, so she decided to choose the most dignified and elegant flower for the Marquise. After some time, Aika looked at her friend in surprise when she carefully wove a small flower into her hair. Harry explained with a gentle smile that it was a small gift for the girl and invited her to come again. The Marquis sighed heavily again and informed his niece that he would go ahead and wait for her outside. A moment later, Aika asked her friend to prepare the most beautiful flower for her, and the saleswoman was embarrassed by the unusual request. A little later, the girl came out of the store, and the Marquis froze in surprise, noticing her load. He looked at the huge flower, almost her height, in bewilderment, not understanding how she had managed to carry it at all. But Aika only beamed with a smile and admitted that she had spent a long time choosing the most beautiful flower for him. She happily explained that such a flower should give her uncle strength during hard work. The Marquis sighed, understanding the sincerity of her intentions, although he still had no idea what to do with such a gift. He also grumbled that the girl had almost spent all his money. Aika puffed out her cheeks, because she knew very well that her uncle could be unbearably stubborn at times. She angrily looked away and made it clear that he could do whatever he wanted with the flower. The Marquis sighed quietly, noticing her offense, and gently suggested that they continue on their way. After some time, the carriage stopped at the main gate, and no one understood the reason for the sudden stop. The Marquis came out and asked the knight curiously what had happened. Gerard explained that the young gentleman they had met earlier had come insisting on an apology to the young lady and the Marquis. He admitted that he did not know what to do, because they sincerely wanted to make amends. The Marquis thought for a moment and invited his niece to go with him. The young lady immediately agreed and happily went forward to meet events. Soon they saw a trembling lady who froze in surprise. The young lady froze for a moment when she noticed the Marquis next to her fellow tribeswoman. Without wasting a minute, the young people fell on their knees before the girl, full of remorse. One of them excitedly shouted that he sincerely regretted it and would never repeat his insolence again. The young lady pleaded with a trembling voice to show mercy just this once. She noted that they even prepared modest gifts as an apology. Opening the small box, she saw neatly wrapped gifts brought in the carriage. The Marquis looked sternly at the young people and asked his niece her opinion. He added that if she doesn't want it, she doesn't have to accept the gifts at all. Aika looked closely at the young men and then decisively declared that she did not need gifts. The girl smiled and remembered her mother's words that apologies require courage and decided to forgive them. Aika sternly warned that such a thing should not happen again, and the young people beamed with happiness and thanked her. After some time, she met her friend and happily told him everything. He asked if his words had hurt her, and she replied with a smile that everything was fine now. Ruspa noted that she and her mother are simply amazing, and then he thanked her for the flowers, promising to take care of them. Aika happily explained that she chose exactly those flowers that reminded her of him. The young man sheepishly admitted that he had also prepared a gift for the girl. The young lady with shining eyes asked if she could open it right now. He smiled and she opened the box, her eyes filled with delight at the sight of the cute slippers. She really liked them, and she simply could not take her eyes off such beauty. Aika happily thanked her friend and promised to wear them every day after returning home. Ruspe was incredibly happy that she liked the gift. The girl suggested playing together and asked what games he liked. Ruspe, smiling, agreed to play whatever she wanted, wanting to spend time together. But he was soon taken aback by the stern voice of a man who scolded him for wasting his time. The man sternly declared that the future crown prince should not waste his days on fun. Ruspe apologized, explaining that he only wanted to play on his day off. The old man was furious, because the future heir to the throne should not have free time for games. Aika was furious and did not understand who was in front of her and why her friend should apologize to this person. Her eyes lit up, and along with her rage, her sense of injustice flared up. He assumed the boy was smart, but he needed guidance, so he decided to personally tutor him on his day off. At that very moment, the young lady blocked his path, resolutely not allowing him to take his friend. The Duke looked at Aika with bewilderment and casually asked what she was doing. But the girl was not going to give up and shouted at him not to offend her friend by calling him grandfather. This stunned the man. Unfortunately, she didn't know who exactly was standing in front of her, but Aika noticed green hair, blue eyes, and a shield with a vine. The girl realized that in front of her was Gale de Notium, the son of the Duke, close to the Emperor. She knew the Duke deserved respect, but she didn't understand why he was bullying her friend. The Duke, slightly taken aback, asked who she was, and Aika quickly introduced herself. Gale was amazed to notice that the girl's family was no longer hiding her. He noted her courage and introduced himself personally, calling himself Gael de Notium. Aika was taken aback when she realized that the person in front of her was the Duke's son, not the Duke himself, and she understood why her thoughts were confused. Gale looked closely at the girl and reminded her that her grandfather taught her to respect her elders. Aika replied that he had studied, but he also knew that adults who bully children are bad people. The Duke noticed her youth and said that a young man should not waste his time, but she objected that children had a right to their actions. He was shocked by her persistence and shouted at her not to go too far, noting that she was very similar in character to her grandfather. Aika sternly declared that he was bad and had no right to offend her friend. At that moment, the girl was taken aback when her friend unexpectedly hugged her from behind. She was speechless, not understanding what had just happened. Ruspe thanked his friend and assured her that he was fine. He then turned to the Duke in surprise, showing unusual boldness. The young man stated that he had set aside time specifically for entertainment, but had never neglected his studies or fencing, and had done nothing that could disgrace the emperor. He looked at the Duke intently and asked him to trust him, assuring him that he had no intention of letting anyone down. As he left, the Duke sighed heavily and stated that if the emperor had been married, such problems would not have arisen, adding that the boy should not waste his time. He then turned to the young lady and remarked that this instruction applied to her as well. Aika looked after him angrily because her mother said that the Duke and his family were worthy of respect, but reality disappointed her. Ruspe smiled softly and told his friend not to be too angry, as the Duke was simply worried about him. A moment later, Aika cast aside all resentment and, with a smile, took her friend's hand, deciding to show him something interesting. He looked at her in surprise and asked where she was going to take him. The young people soon found themselves in the archives, and Gerard, with a smile, warned them of the need to be careful. He also reported that the key to the archive was in Aika's bag, for which she thanked him. Without wasting a minute, the girl grabbed her friend and cheerfully announced that it was time for them to go. Soon they were looking with delight at rows of ancient and beautiful books, immersing themselves in their world. The young lady suggested that her friend go a little further because she knew where the section with fairy tales was. She noticed a slight sadness on his face and didn't know how to cheer him up. So she went to look for something funny and interesting among the shelves. But soon her gaze fell on an empty shelf, and she was momentarily confused. At that very second, an idea was born in my head: to secretly hide and suddenly jump out, to slightly scare him and make him happy at the same time. After a moment, she made up her mind, carefully crawling inside, noticing the space around her. Ruspe turned to address his friend, but was stunned to notice that she was not there. After some time, Ruspe and Gerard hurried to the Marquis, the boy's heart trembling with fear. The Marquis looked at him in bewilderment, noticing how the boy was trembling, and the knight next to him was no less alarmed. He asked in surprise if his niece had gone home, trying to understand the situation. But at that very moment, the knight reported that the young lady had disappeared, and the Marquis froze, struck by the unexpected news. Ruspe, trembling and with tears in his eyes, confessed that his friend had disappeared, and that they had searched the entire archive but had not found her, blaming himself. The Marquis approached the boy, gently told him that he should not blame himself, and asked him not to tremble like an autumn leaf, but to follow him. Ruspe sighed heavily and agreed, trusting the Marquis's instructions. Soon they hurriedly ran to the archives, and the Marquis kept trying to understand where his niece could have disappeared to. He hoped and prayed to everyone that she would be okay, his heart beating anxiously and strongly. After some time, the Marquis took out his anger on the knight, loudly expressing his dissatisfaction. The young man tried to calm him down, reminding him that all the castle's soldiers were already involved in the search for the young lady. But the Marquis looked at them with fury and sternly declared that no one should interfere with him. The young man was puzzled. The Marquis was clearly crossing the line, since his actions in the imperial palace could be considered treason. The emperor stood quietly to the side, watching the tense scene. He approached his friend and asked him to calm down, vowing that he would definitely find the girl. Castle, filled with rage, looked angrily at the emperor and doubted his power to control the situation. He stated that if the emperor had not given the key to his niece, none of this would have happened. The emperor sighed heavily, acknowledged his recklessness, but assured her that the girl would be fine. He asked the Marquise to wait a little, but the Marquise became furious, realizing that the key given by the emperor was the reason for her disappearance. He shouted that first, the emperor had ruined his sister's life, and now he was destroying his niece. The emperor sighed heavily and said that if the Marquis did not trust him, he should trust his sister. It was she who left the key to her daughter. He added that he simply could not refuse his friend her request. The Marquis looked at the emperor with bewilderment, realizing that he had been a bit hasty, and let him go, allowing him to live. But a moment later, the knight burst in with the news that the young lady had been found. Ruspe, overwhelmed with joy, rushed to his friend, feeling great relief and anxiety for her. With tears in his eyes, he looked closely at Aika and asked if she was hurt, and she, with a smile, apologized for the fright and assured him that everything was fine. The young lady was taken aback when she heard her uncle's stern voice, which was full of anger and fury. She looked at the Marquis with puzzlement, noticing how his eyes were blazing with anger. The Marquis asked where she had been, and Aika tried to explain that she wanted to make a surprise for a friend. But before she could finish speaking, her uncle hugged her tightly, stunning her with his sudden sternness. Aika looked at him in surprise, and the Marquis noticed that she had frightened everyone and again asked if she was injured. The girl assured her that she was fine, but the Marquis strictly forbade her to appear in the palace, leaving her in shock. Rusp was taken aback for a moment, as he realized that he could lose his friend. Rusp couldn't stand it and boldly called his uncle, gathering his resolve to protect his friend. He confidently declared that he would not allow her to get lost in the palace again, proving his courage. The Marquis, leaving, noted that his niece was now forbidden to appear in the imperial palace, but if they wanted to play, he could come to their home. Ruspe swore that this would never happen again and that he would take care of her safety, impressing the Marquis with his determination. The Marquis looked at the boy in bewilderment, realizing the strength and confidence emanating from him. Sighing heavily, the Marquis promised to think about his words and said that it was time for them to go. The young lady said goodbye to her friend with a joyful smile, and Ruspa responded warmly. She sighed heavily and silently asked her family for forgiveness, not daring to reveal the whole truth, knowing that no one would believe it. A few hours ago, a young lady found herself in an unknown place and suddenly saw a strange beast. She looked in surprise at the rabbit who spoke to her, asking who she was. Aika was taken aback. She didn't expect the rabbit to talk and asked in surprise if he had seen anyone else. The rabbit slowly approached and asked if she knew Syria. Her mother's name caught the girl off guard. Aika asked in amazement how the rabbit could know her mother. A smile appeared on the rabbit's face as he noted that she was Syria's daughter and introduced himself as a friend of her mother. The girl thought she didn't even know that her mother had a ghost friend in the form of a rabbit. Aika was shocked when he declared that he was not a ghost at all. Soon the rabbit noticed that time was running out and said that he would be back soon, leaving Aika puzzled. She was shocked to watch the rabbit walk through the walls. Then, Aika tried to repeat the trick with the passage, but she didn't succeed. Soon she screamed as she saw a small statue emerge from the wall. Lepus handed her what her mother had left behind, explaining that it had been sealed in a tablet and awakened by her mother, Indicator. Aika listened in bewilderment, not understanding what was being discussed, but the rabbit smiled and clarified that she was a seeker and asked if her mother had ever told her about such a thing. The girl sighed heavily and admitted that she had never heard anything like it. Aika added sadly that her mother had recently died. Lepus looked at her puzzledly, but soon understood what her friend meant when she spoke those last words. He sighed and explained that his mother had said that someone very important would come someday, and now he realized it was the young lady. Lepus declared that the day had come when the girl needed to learn the truth about the predators, and he must protect her. Aika looked at him in surprise, at a loss to guess the meaning of his words. Soon the cute rabbit used magic and showed her many records, revealing the secrets of the past. He showed who the predators, or hunters, were, incredibly dangerous creatures, and told about their origin. There used to be a god who maintained balance, but one day he disappeared, leaving the absolute viceroy and handing over 10 relics with divine power to Hiratek. The absolute handed over the relics to the Seekers, the god's former assistants who were supposed to preserve the peace. But the envious began to hunt the Seekers and steal relics, and so the predators appeared, and their power has remained to this day. Even now, Seekers search for relics, and predators hunt them, and Ayaka has inherited the Seeker's power, even as she dreads wondering if she will be hunted as well. Aika looked at her new acquaintance with surprise and confusion, trying to understand how he was going to protect her. He explained that if the Seeker awakens a sleeping relic, it can grant him its abilities. The series, besides him, awakened many relics and gained the power to bind a person's legs and skillfully bypass the rain. The young lady was shocked. She did not expect that her mother had such unusual abilities. Aika reported that after eating the gemstone given to her by her mother, she gained the ability to see the future. Lepus sighed heavily and noticed that her mother seemed to have forcibly awakened the power. He stated that Ike needed to develop her abilities and collect relics to counter the hunters, as Seekers could sense the energy of relics. The hunters could not find the relics themselves, but they recognized the Seekers and harmed them, taking the relics for greed. Seekers must avoid predators, learn to control their power, and hide their energy. Lepus noted that Ika had already met Serpens, but had not yet fully awakened him, which surprised the girl a little. He asked her if she had seen a snake with one red eye. Ika was taken aback, remembering her encounter with the snake, and said that it was just a dream. Lepus explained that she had to wake him up as soon as possible, although she didn't yet understand how. He said that you just need to call him by name. This frightened Ika, because the snake seemed scary to her. Lepus noted that now was not the time, and that there was something scary at her door, so she needed to go back and check everything. He sighed and added that there was no time to explain anymore. She needed to act before she was scolded even more. Ika looked at him in bewilderment. After some time, Ika wondered what she should do, but she understood that she could not delay. She remembered the rabbit's advice to call her new friend by name, which made her afraid. Her heart was beating wildly. As soon as she called the snake's name, it would appear. At the same time, she remembered the terrible fangs of the snake. She was scared, but she understood that she had no choice. Plucking up her courage, she screamed and called out to the snake when the Marquis entered the room and asked in surprise what was going on. Ika was taken aback. She didn't expect to see her uncle and hesitated, explaining that he had entered illegally. The Marquis merely stated that nothing had happened and that he needed to visit the palace for a short while she was to remain alone to dine. Ika begged her uncle to take her to the palace, but he firmly refused, leaving her in shock. The girl screamed, reminding him that he himself had previously spoken about the possibility, but the Marquis sighed heavily and explained that he had changed his mind. As he left, he stated that he did not plan to take her with him in the near future. He stated that she had to come to terms with it. The young lady was stunned, tormented by the thought that she would not be able to see the Emperor and meet the talking rabbit again. After some time, the Marquis asked the Emperor if he had seen how his niece had almost found herself in danger. The Emperor sighed with understanding, explaining that he wanted to fulfill his friend's will and hoped that the girl would at least be able to freely visit the library. Cassel asked the Emperor if he had any plan, and he confirmed it with a smile. A moment later, the Emperor handed something to the Marquis, and something like this would allow the girl to freely visit the library. The Marquis asked in surprise whether this would not cause a stir among the nobles demanding justice. The Emperor assured that everything would remain secret, as he wanted to correct his successor's feelings of guilt. Meanwhile, the young lady sat quietly in the room, hearing her uncle leave. Ika intended to try to summon the snake again. After a moment, she finally plucked up her courage and screamed. But, unfortunately, and to her surprise, nothing happened. Moments later, she began to look around hastily and called the snake's name again, but she saw nothing nearby. At that very moment, the young lady froze in a daze as she could not breathe. She was scared because she was just in the room, and now she couldn't breathe. She couldn't understand what was happening, and so I mentally called out to the snake. But moments later, the young lady came to her senses and stood frozen in stupor and horror as she saw a large snake. She was in shock, but a moment later, all her fear disappeared. The snake asked the young lady shyly if she had called him. For a moment, she looked at the small snake in bewilderment. She could not understand and accept the fact that the formidable snake was looking at her with sweet eyes. Serpens looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and stated that he would introduce himself properly. The young lady froze for a moment as she saw that the snake had eyes the same color as the stone it had eaten. She saw that the snake was cute. Serpens asked the lady why she was looking at it so intently. Then Ayeka introduced herself and asked the snake if she really had the power to see the future. She also stated that the rabbit told her that each relic had a special gift. She said with a smile that she thought so, because she gained her power after eating a stone that was exactly the same color as her eye. The snake praised the girl with a smile. She also stated that the stronger her power, the more detailed and accurate she can see the future of anyone she wants. Serpens told the girl that she did not need to worry, because since she had summoned her, she would help her in all her endeavors. The young lady sighed heavily and stated that she wanted to meet the rabbit and tell him that she had met her, but she could not get into the archives. She also stated that her uncle had gone to the imperial palace, and then the snake said that she could go with him. The young lady then became hopeful. After some time, she again turned to her uncle, but heard a categorical refusal, because he did not intend to take her to the palace. He sighed and said he didn't know what kind of trouble she might cause again. At that very moment, the young lady declared that this was not what she wanted to ask, as she simply wanted to write a letter to her friend and invite him to visit. The Marquise thought for a moment and stated that such a thing could be done, and the young lady happily thanked him. Then he said that starting next week, he would hire a teacher for her so that she could study, since all children her age had to go to school. Eika looked at her uncle with embarrassment and agreed with him, and also asked if he could take her to the house where she lived with her mother. The Marquis thought for a moment, but a moment later, as he was leaving, he announced that he would take her later when it was a little safer, and the young lady beamed with joy. At the same time, she bombarded him with questions because she wanted to know when they would leave, but he answered her coldly. Eika looked at her uncle with a satisfied smile and declared that if he fulfilled her request, she would give him a kiss on the cheek. The Marquis was taken aback for a moment, as he did not expect to hear such a thing, as did all the other knights. He was shocked and did not understand what a kiss had to do with fulfilling requests. Eika stated that her kiss was expensive. She also said that her mother once said that she could use kisses when she wanted to ask her uncle for something. The Marquis froze for a moment with a sweet smile on his face. Then he, looking away from her with embarrassment, declared that he would think about her requests, and in exchange she could kiss him several times. The young lady was shocked. She shouted that he was very greedy. He, with a gray smile, asked if she really wanted to say that he was not worthy of such a thing. Eika sighed heavily, because she knew she couldn't do anything, so she asked him to bend over. A moment later, the young lady kissed her uncle tenderly, but since she wanted to achieve her goals, she did not finish with one kiss, and continued kissing him. He looked at her in surprise and asked her with a smile why she kissed him 3 times. She smiled and said that one was a gift from her. He looked closely at his niece and asked if she was sure that this was not a bribe for some prank she had pulled in secret. The young lady denied this, and a moment later said that it was time for her to go write a letter to her friend. After some time, the young lady wrote a letter to her friend with joyful excitement, warmly interested in his affairs and inviting him to her estate. Eika dreamed of seeing him again and playing with him, so she waited for his answer with trepidation. The young man was surprised when he received a letter from his girlfriend, unexpected and warm. He immediately began to read the lines, and the girl's sincere words deeply touched his heart. But soon he froze in a daze because his father appeared nearby and noticed a letter from Eika. Ruspe looked at the Duke with bewilderment, not expecting to see him so suddenly. The Duke coldly inquired about the contents of the letter, watching his son closely. Rusp calmly explained that his friend had simply invited him to her estate. The Duke paused, feeling a troubling suspicion at the sudden appearance of the former Chancellor's illegitimate daughter. He strictly ordered his son not to go to the meeting, which greatly puzzled the boy. As he left, the Duke stated that his son should not know the reasons for the ban, since the decision had already been made. Ruspe was deeply distressed by what he heard and hastened to stop his father. He shouted with unexpected determination that this meeting was very important to him. The Duke turned around in surprise, not expecting such a bold objection. Ruspe sadly explained that his friend's family was loyal to the Emperor and their homes should strengthen the bond. He quietly admitted that he felt a duty to the young lady, and the Duke, with cold bewilderment, reminded his son of his fate as Crown Prince. Ruspe calmly stated that the Marquis had teachers, so he would not abandon his studies and asked to be allowed to go. The Duke was amazed because his son had never argued with his decisions before. After a short pause, he finally agreed, sternly warning her not to disgrace their home. The boy beamed with happiness and bowed gratefully to his father. Inside, he was shaking with fear, because for the first time he dared to contradict the Duke. However, the thought of meeting his friend gave him courage. With each new visit, he felt that something was changing inside him. He liked this strange, warm feeling, so he looked forward to the meeting. But after their meeting, an event occurred that shook him to the depths of his soul. Then he realized that if he had known about the danger to his friend, he would never have come. He was tormented by a deep sense of guilt because he had failed to protect his friend, to whom he had once made a promise. After some time, the young man came to his friend and with a warm smile thanked her for the invitation to visit. He handed her a small box containing a gift, and the young lady happily accepted it, sincerely thanking her friend. Eika noted his new hairstyle with tenderness, and he sheepishly wondered if he looked strange. The girl smiled softly, assuring him that the new hairstyle suited him amazingly, which made him even more confused. A moment later, he thanked her for the pleasant compliment. Aika cheerfully grabbed her friend's hand and asked if he had ever baked a cake. With a beaming smile, she reminded him of an old promise to bake a dessert together and take it on a picnic. After a while, the friends changed their clothes and were ready to get to work. Sophie, with a kind smile, invited them to start cooking. While they were cooking, Aika happily praised her friend, because everything turned out surprisingly well. Ruspe waved his hand sheepishly, assuring that anyone could have done it, but he noticed that his friend wasn't doing it very neatly. Then he awkwardly remarked that her cake simply looked more special and even more interesting. Aika came closer and noticed that there was cream left on his face. She reached out to gently wipe it away, and the boy froze in embarrassment. For a while, he looked at his friend in confusion, unable to find words. Aika smiled and called her friend, but he did not answer her. Their awkward atmosphere was suddenly interrupted by Sophia entering the room and asking about their progress. She asked in surprise if they had run out of ingredients, as the cooking was still ongoing, and Ruspe quickly explained the situation. Sophia cheerfully announced that she had brought chocolate, strawberry, and vanilla food markers for decoration. After some time, the friends went on a long-awaited picnic. They enjoyed the prepared desserts with gusto and without any embarrassment. Zenda noted with a satisfied smile that these sweets seemed tastier precisely because they made them themselves. The maid then said that she would bring refreshments, leaving them to enjoy themselves. Aika asked her friend, with a mysterious smile, if he wanted to see something cute. She showed him a small bag of sweets, which she generously shared with him, and the young man gratefully accepted the treat. Soon the girl suggested playing by the lake, and he agreed, only asking not to get too close to the water. Meanwhile, a gloomy and cunning raven was watching them. The observation didn't last long. The bird quickly flew up and snatched the bag from Aika's hands. The girl rushed after the raven, because the bag contained the contract signed with her uncle. Ruspe shouted in fear to his friend not to run too far. He hurried after her, but stumbled and fell heavily to the ground. Raising his head after the blow, he continued to desperately call for his friend. Aika was unable to catch the bird, but she noticed that the bag had fallen into the lake and was very close. She reached for the water and almost managed to reach it. However, her foot slipped and the girl fell straight into the cold lake. In the water, she was overcome with shock. Her breath disappeared, and pain pierced her body. She was choking with fear and desperately called her family for help. She then called out to her friend, who at that very moment called upon his power, trying to save her. After a few moments, Aika suddenly realized that she could breathe. She looked at Rusp in surprise. The girl was shocked, because she didn't even suspect that her friend had such strength. Using his strength, he pulled her out of the water and looked at her with relief and concern. Aika was shocked and clearly understood that it was he who saved her life. Then Aika rushed towards her friend in fear, anxiously examining him and trying to understand whether he had been injured after the fall. She excitedly asked if it was really he who pulled her ashore, because it seemed incredible to her. The young man assured her that he was fine, although his head was still spinning from the intense strain. Then he admitted that it was he who carried her to dry land, and Aika froze in amazement. She exclaimed in delight, unable to believe that he could perform such a miracle. Ruspe smiled sheepishly and explained that he simply used magic. The girl was shocked, because such things only existed in books, but he quietly asked to keep it a secret. He admitted that people with such power are extremely rare, so he has to hide his abilities. Aika looked at her friend in amazement, realizing that a real magician was in front of her. With a gentle smile, he handed her the pouch he had found and said that he had obtained it with the help of his power. Aika was so happy that she instantly hugged him and pressed herself against him with sincere gratitude. Ruspe understood how important this bag was to her, so he could not leave her in trouble. He carefully warned that revealing his power could lead to serious problems. A moment later, Aika became alarmed at the possible danger and hastened to assure him that she would not tell anyone. The girl looked seriously at her friend and noted that even between close people, there should sometimes be secrets. With a warm smile, she promised to keep his secret carefully. While they were quietly talking, an excited maid ran towards them as fast as she could. Hearing her anxious voice, the children looked at each other in surprise. Aika quickly grabbed her friend's hand and quietly admitted on the way that she would also tell him one secret. She cheerfully admitted that she had a loose front tooth and another one on the bottom, which the maid didn't even know about. The girl added sheepishly that she would soon have to rip it out, but for now she was keeping it a secret. Rusp looked at her in surprise and promised to keep her little secret. A moment later, they ran up to the maid, who asked in surprise what they were talking about so animatedly. The children looked at each other and with sly smiles declared that it was their common secret. After some time, the young lady studied with a tutor and answered every question with ease, amazing the teacher. The madam noted with a satisfied smile that the girl was incredibly capable and had an amazing talent for learning. She also reported that the imperial language teacher had been in a minor accident and would not be able to come today. As she left, Madame gently announced the end of the lesson, but reminded her about homework. Aika happily said goodbye to the teacher and said that she was looking forward to meeting her again. Serpens looked closely at the girl and sternly reminded her that she shouldn't waste her power on trifles. Snake angrily declared that the ability to see the future should only be used for safety and serious purposes. Aika apologized guiltily and promised not to use her power so thoughtlessly again. Day after day, she tried to persuade her uncle to take her to the palace, but she only received refusals, so she began to train diligently with the snake. She studied diligently and gradually got used to her strength, although the snake constantly reminded her that she was still very far from perfection. Serpens said again and again that the girl was too distracted by her worries and thoughts. Aika sighed heavily and promised to try even harder. Serpens explained that to see the future, one must feel a person's energy. She added that everyone has a unique energy, so she suggested practicing on the servants. Soon they approached the people working, and the snake asked if the girl felt their energy. Aika understood that it would be difficult at first, but she believed that she would learn over time. She looked closely at the people around her, trying to catch the right energy. Suddenly, she turned around sharply, hearing a familiar voice. The young man asked with a friendly smile what the young lady was doing. Aika replied with a slight smile that she was not doing anything special and asked where he was going. He said that he had carried out the Marquis's order and was reporting, and the girl noticed her name in the documents. Legier explained that these were papers with her personal budget. Aika sighed heavily and remembered how her uncle joked that she was ruining the house and was surprised to notice a lot of zeros. Legier smiled and said that the Marquis was just teasing her, because even a golden carriage would not have ruined their family. The girl thought about his words, but suddenly felt very weak. She looked at the young man in confusion and saw an alarming red glow around him. The girl's body began to tremble, and the young man immediately noticed her condition. He asked worriedly if she was okay. When he reached out to her, Aika suddenly grabbed his hand. Then she suddenly let go of him and quickly ran away, promising to see him later. The young man looked after her in confusion, not understanding the reason for her strange behavior. Aika told Serpens that she saw strange energy around him, but was unable to see the future. The snake advised me to look at him from behind next time. Aika immediately followed the snake's advice. Seeing the young man from behind, she became even more confused. Serpens asked if the girl could now see the future. A moment later, Aika quietly said that she had seen something alarming and that she would need the help of her faithful snake. After some time, the Marquis angrily shouted at his subordinate, as he had failed to properly complete the assigned work, and the tension in the office grew stronger. At that moment, the young man awkwardly admitted that he seemed to have left the necessary documents on his desk. Kaisel frowned and asked his subordinate with cold irritation whether the documents had suddenly grown legs and run away from the office on their own. The young man quickly asked for forgiveness and promised that he would bring all the documents early tomorrow morning. A few minutes later, the young man left his master's office, fully aware that he would now have to spend the whole night without sleep. Meanwhile, the young lady looked at her snake with a satisfied and slightly sly smile, because her plan had finally worked. But she understood perfectly well that now she needed to buy as much time as possible. A moment later, the young lady rushed into the office and loudly called for her uncle's assistant, breathing heavily. The men looked at her in bewilderment, because they did not expect to see the girl at such a time. Legier asked, with a slight smile, why she had burst in so suddenly, and jokingly asked if she wanted some candy. The Marquis looked menacingly at his niece and sternly stated that she already ate too many sweets and that her teeth could get damaged. Aika irritably waved away his words and insistently said that he definitely needed to look at the document. The Marquis looked at the girl in bewilderment, and then she quickly explained that there had been a lot of thieves lately. Aika excitedly explained that they were breaking into houses, stealing things, and even injuring people, so Legier had to check everything carefully. The Marquise was stunned because the girl was worried not about him at all, but about his assistant. Legier thanked the young lady with a grateful smile and confidently said that he was strong enough and everything would be fine with him. But Aika excitedly shouted that he still had to be very careful, and a moment later, the Marquise could not stand it any longer, took his niece by the hand, and said that it was time for her to go play and not interfere with their work. Castle informed the young lady that from tomorrow she would be living with her grandfather, and he would also send her tutor there, so she would have to study there. He sighed heavily and added that he had to leave for the estate, so she would only stay with her grandfather for a week, and at the same time strictly warned her not to follow him. After some time, the young lady was gently but firmly escorted out of the office. With tears in her eyes, she wondered if she had done the right thing. Realizing that even if her hint had not been understood, she had still managed to buy a little time. Aika knew she had done everything she could, and now she only hoped that the Marquis's assistant would be safe. Meanwhile, the young man returned home and kept thinking about the young lady because her behavior seemed strange to him. Legier knew she had been running to the office all this time, as if trying to stall for time, and he wondered if it was just childish curiosity. However, he was pleased that someone was so worried about him, and so he decided to be especially careful. A moment later, he entered his house and suddenly became wary, sensing someone else's presence. Legier immediately jumped up and rushed to pursue the unknown man, but a moment later, he realized that the stranger had managed to escape. Legier stopped dead in his tracks as the young lady's words echoed in his head. He was shocked to notice that the locks on all the boxes had been broken and wondered what exactly the thieves were looking for. The next day, the young man reported to the Marquise that someone had broken into his house. Legier sighed heavily and explained that he had decided to return immediately and report this, since it was clear from the tracks that there were several of them. He then added that, thanks to the young lady's warning, he had been especially careful, and the Marquis had immediately ordered him to take a guard with him from now on. Legier, with a slight smile, said that he would take it as a concern, but added that it was now time for him to get back to work. Meanwhile, the Marquis thoughtfully recalled the words of his niece. Cassel took the document she had brought and noticed that Aika's story contained surprisingly precise details. He was amazed that in her story, one criminal suddenly turned into three. The Marquis understood that the girl had made up a lot of things, but still the details suspiciously matched what the assistant had told her. Cassel considered this to be complete absurdity, because no matter how smart his niece was, this was too much even for her. The Marquis convinced himself that his niece could not possibly see the future, and such thoughts seemed absurd to him. After some time, the young lady joyfully ran to her grandfather, who greeted her with a warm and radiant smile. Cassel looked closely at his niece and declared that he had called all the tutors to the palace so that she should not think about games, but should study hard. Aika sighed heavily and nodded, agreeing with him. Ilad, with a joyful smile, told his granddaughter not to be sad, and added that they would do everything to make her happy. He also asked her where she wanted to go, and at that moment, the young lady's eyes lit up, because she already knew where she wanted to go. The Marquis approached his niece closely and asked if she really intended to go to the imperial palace. She was taken aback and said with a smile that this was not so, because she simply wanted a palace carriage. And the Duke said with a smile that if she was bored with their black carriage, he would buy her a gold one. She was taken aback, smiling, and added that she would like a very small carriage for someone to take her to the imperial palace, but she could not say it directly because of her uncle. A moment later, the Duke noticed a tutor of the imperial language who had come to see his granddaughter. Aika was taken aback when she saw the man, but Raquel looked at her with a smile and immediately introduced himself. Raquel asked the young lady with a smile if she knew at least a little of the imperial language. Aika smiled and said that she knew it a little, and he said with a smile that it was impressive for her age, and suggested that she try to write the words that she knew. The young lady began writing the names of her relatives. A moment later, she was taken aback and froze in shock because she did not remember how to spell her friend's name correctly. She was puzzled and wondered if she had made a mistake in the letter she had written earlier. The man said with a smile that it looked like she was finished and wanted to see what she had written. He was surprised. Aika was taken aback because she had not yet finished writing, and he had already taken her sheet of paper. The man looked closely at the sheet of paper and said with a smirk that she could only write the names of family members, and as the chancellor's daughter, he expected more. Apparently, her mother had no talent for teaching. Aika was taken aback, not understanding why he started talking about her mother. The man said that she would have to make more efforts to avoid disgracing the Duke and Marquise, who were taking care of her. A moment later, a young maid entered the office and asked the lady if she had enjoyed the lesson. She told the man that the lesson would have to be finished. He was surprised, because he saw a diligent student. A moment later, he looked at the young lady with a sly grin and declared that they would see each other next time. She was taken aback and said goodbye to him at that very moment. Serpens, looking at the young lady, asked if she was going to say something. Aika asked with bewilderment what it was about. Serpens was seething with rage and wanted the girl to tell her grandfather about the teacher who dared to reproach her mother. Aika smiled and stated that the teacher was honest, and she would try to be praised. That same evening, the Duke looked intently at his daughter's photograph. She was calmer than her brother, but he knew that when she got into trouble, it was always in a big way. Like when, despite the rumors, she suddenly disappeared and returned with an exhausted child in her arms. She was in a terrible state, but she managed to force a smile and greet her father. The Duke was shocked. He didn't expect to see his daughter in such a state. He wanted to know what kind of child she had in her arms and where she had been for several years. Syria apologized to her father, but said she couldn't say anything. He was puzzled, not understanding how she could do this to her own father. But at the same time, he intended to protect his granddaughter. Moments later, all his thoughts disappeared when he saw his granddaughter. He ran up with a smile and asked what had happened that she had come so late. The young lady timidly stated that she wanted to go somewhere with him. She plucked up her courage and shouted that she wanted to go to the imperial palace. The Duke was puzzled and did not know how to answer. He remembered his son, who said that if his niece asked for a palace, he shouldn't give in. The Duke suggested reading a book in another library. Aika sighed. She wanted the old archive. She said she wanted to read where her mother had left a place for her. The Duke froze in shock, but was pleasantly surprised by her desire to return to where her mother was. He looked at her closely and asked if she really wanted to go there. The young lady only responded with a look. He smiled and said that she should promise to play only in the old archive. Aika agreed and asked to keep it a secret from her uncle. The maid said with a smile that the guardian would be furious if he found out. Aika assured them that they would keep the secret. A moment later, she happily jumped off the chair to quickly go to the palace. Turning around, she thanked the maid for getting her ready, but a minute later, the maid stopped her and said that she needed to put something on. Aika was shocked, not expecting such a thing from the maid. Serpens looked at the lady with a smile and declared that she was beaming with happiness. Aika sighed and asked the snake not to tease her. A moment later, the Duke took the keys to the old archives. He told his granddaughter that the Count wanted to talk to him, so she should go to the archives herself. Aika kissed her grandfather with a joyful smile and thanked him for bringing her to the palace. After the kiss, the Duke screamed that he could not leave his precious granddaughter, and the young lady rushed to the archives. Upon entering the archive, the young lady quietly asked her friend if she felt anything unusual, and the snake replied that she felt the presence of the rabbit, as relics are able to sense each other. At the same time, the maid kept a close eye on the girl the whole time, never taking her wary gaze off her. Aika understood that she needed to get to her new friend as soon as possible. But as soon as she turned around, she again saw the maid, who continued to closely watch her every movement. Aika smiled a little confusedly and waved her hand awkwardly. Then she quietly whispered to her snake that the maid was not taking her eyes off her at all, and Serpens wondered how she could distract her attention. But a moment later, the snake looked at her mistress with a sly smile and said that she knew one good way. At that very moment, the maid screamed in surprise because books suddenly began to fall with a crash next to her. Serpens shouted to her mistress that this was their chance, and she should quickly go inside while the maid was distracted. The young lady hurried forward, but, to her regret, stumbled and fell awkwardly, and Serpens, with a slight smile, said that this is how movements between spaces usually occur. A moment later, the rabbit ran up to her and greeted her with a joyful smile, and the young lady also smiled, because they had not seen each other for a long time. Aika quickly said that she had come to him secretly, so she had to leave soon before she was noticed, but she promised to definitely return. Lepus was visibly upset to hear this, and asked her not to leave so quickly, as he wanted to help her. A moment later, the rabbit used his magic. Using his power, he adjusted the flow of time, and the young lady gasped in surprise. She was shocked because she suddenly saw her own image in front of her. Lepus calmly explained that he linked her appearance to another timeline to show a projection from the same moment in time. He added that it might look a little strange, but people outside wouldn't notice her disappearance. And Aika was amazed because she didn't quite understand his words, but still decided that it was incredible. Lepus looked at the young lady with a kind smile and asked her to tell him what had happened to her recently. After listening to her story, the rabbit was genuinely surprised because he realized that she had made great progress in her training and had already learned to see the future much better. Aika proudly praised her snake for its help, but immediately noticed that they began to argue among themselves and was surprised because she thought they got along well. The girl quickly dismissed these thoughts and recalled that the rabbit had previously spoken of relics and a hunter, but she still did not understand how to recognize him. Lepus sighed heavily and admitted that she was right, promising to explain everything in detail. After a moment, he stepped aside and asked her to wait a little. He soon returned and handed her an old book that detailed the stories of hunters. The book was written in an ancient language, but thanks to the power of the seeker, the young lady was still able to read it. Having looked closely at the text, the girl made out one important word: predator. The book said that the lawless robber was the very same predator. These people instinctively sensed the energy of the relics and began to pursue it even before they awakened their own abilities. It also said that if she had already found the relic, she should pay attention to the moment when she would suddenly feel a chill. This feeling meant that the predator was very close. Lepus added that his previous owner said that when she sensed a hunter or a trap, all her senses seemed to converge at one point. He then gently asked if the young lady had ever felt a sudden shiver or cold for no apparent reason. Aika was suddenly taken aback because she remembered the very moment when she felt ill. She clearly remembered how a chill ran through her whole body, and she was puzzled because at that moment it seemed to her that she heard the old man's voice. A moment later, the girl quietly admitted that she had already experienced a similar feeling. Lepus was taken aback because he didn't expect to hear this so quickly, and Rabbit was scared because he realized that it all started much earlier than he expected. Lepus stated that if people had known earlier that she was a seeker, everything would have happened much sooner. But now that she has serpents, she will feel the danger much more acutely. A moment later, the rabbit added that it was time for the young lady to return, because if too much time passed, the illusion might start to look strange. But after just a few steps, the girl stopped, because the rabbit called her again. Lepus looked at his friend in bewilderment and asked why her voice and manner of speech sounded different than before. Aika was taken aback by such a question, and for a moment, Serpens didn't even know what to answer. Then an argument started between them again. Lepus explained that her voice was usually much lower, and she never spoke in such a strange way. And Aika looked at him in confusion, because to her, it didn't seem strange at all. The girl turned to her snake and asked seriously if it was true. Serpens sighed heavily and admitted that she hadn't really intended to hide anything. She explained that when they first met, the young lady was very scared, so she deliberately spoke softly so as not to seem scary. Aika was shocked when she heard her friend's real voice, which turned out to be much deeper. The girl was even a little embarrassed, because the snake changed its voice only so as not to frighten her. Then, Aika looked seriously at her friend and said that she wouldn't be afraid of her even if she became huge, and that her real voice sounded very cool. She added with a smile that serpents could speak in any way that suited her. Lepus watched them with a satisfied smile, glad that the misunderstanding had finally disappeared. After some time, the young lady returned back, feeling relieved that her friends were getting along with each other again. She knew she had to get back before her uncle found out where she had been. But when she emerged from the secret room, she suddenly froze in place. Aika was horrified to see her uncle in front of her. He looked at her with a cold smile and remarked that this was a very unexpected meeting with his beloved niece. Then he asked why someone who should be at home was in such a place. The girl was stunned, because she did not understand how he found out about her secret walk. The Marquis asked, with a slight grin, if she remembered what he had said about disobedience. The young lady muttered in confusion that she could not remember his words. Then he looked at her sternly and asked if she wanted him to help her remember. Aika screamed in fright that she remembered everything perfectly well. After some time, they were already returning to the estate, and the whole way the young lady cried quietly, unable to hold back her bitter tears. Eika looked at her uncle in bewilderment, because she was sure that he would start scolding her as soon as they got into the carriage. But nothing of the sort happened. She was stunned because her uncle had not said a single word the whole time. The girl felt awkward and didn't know what to do, so she secretly hoped that he would say at least something. Finally, Eika plucked up her courage and called out to her uncle in a trembling voice. But the next moment, she smiled awkwardly and asked cautiously if he was still angry. Cassel couldn't resist and cried out sharply, asking if this was really what she called a conversation. The young lady started in surprise and looked at him with tears in her eyes, trembling with fear, and after that, his anger softened a little. He came closer to her and, sighing heavily, quietly asked what he should do with her now. Eika noticed that his gaze had become much warmer, and she timidly thought that perhaps he was no longer so angry. Then she moved closer to him with a cautious smile and giggled quietly. Cassel asked with a slight smile if she was really so happy only because she got what she wanted. The girl smiled even wider and quietly admitted that she simply loved him very much. Cassel was a little embarrassed and asked his niece if everything had been okay while he was not around. Eika nodded happily and said that everything was wonderful and she really enjoyed visiting her grandfather. But a moment later, she smiled again and admitted to her uncle that she had missed him very much all this time. The Marquis was visibly embarrassed and hastily muttered that she should not say such things. Then the young lady looked at him cautiously and asked hopefully if he had forgiven her. The Marquis sighed heavily and, looking away, admitted that he had not yet decided. The next morning, the young lady rushed down the corridor to her uncle's room at full speed, barely containing her joyful excitement. With a wide smile, she jumped right onto his bed and loudly declared that he had to wake up. This is how she woke up her uncle, who was not at all delighted with such a sudden and noisy awakening. Cassel, with difficulty containing his irritation, looked menacingly at her and reminded her that he had already told her not to wake him, while displeasedly calling her short-legged. The young lady immediately objected, but added with a laugh that it was very funny, and therefore she wanted him to shock her again. The Marquise was genuinely shocked that she could even like such a thing. After some time, the Marquis appeared in the dining room, which greatly surprised Madame. He looked back at his niece in surprise, since it was she who had recently complained of severe hunger, but had suddenly disappeared somewhere. Eika explained with a satisfied smile that she had run to get a small brochure. Then she happily added that a museum had opened in the city. The girl excitedly said that her friend had talked about many rare artifacts, so she simply couldn't pass up such a chance. Eika added with a beaming smile that a huge number of ancient and exotic things were kept there, and she would really like to go there with him. In her joy, the young lady also asked if she could take her friend with her, to which the Marquis sighed heavily and replied that he had not yet decided. Then he smiled mysteriously and looked into the distance, as if a clever idea had already arisen in his head, and Eika watched him with puzzlement. A moment later, he smiled again and told his niece that perhaps a few million might convince him. Eika looked at her uncle with joyful surprise, because she had not expected to hear such a thing from him, and then she leaned towards him with a wide smile and quickly kissed him on the cheek several times. The Marquis looked at his niece with a tender smile and warned her that if she started to misbehave, he would immediately take her home, and then suggested sending a letter to a friend and inviting him to the museum. Eika was incredibly happy to hear this and thought that as soon as she finished breakfast, she would immediately tell her friend everything. A moment later, the Marquis looked at his niece in bewilderment, because he did not understand what she had been doing all this time if she had only just left now. Without looking at her uncle, the girl quickly declared that they needed to hurry, because her friend was already tired of waiting. The Marquis looked at her carefully and suddenly asked what happened to her mouth. Eika was taken aback by fear and quickly replied that nothing had happened to her and that her tooth was not loose at all. He looked at her suspiciously, but the girl quickly added that he shouldn't bother his head with such trifles. Some time ago, the maid carefully examined her mistress's teeth. After a long examination, she declared that very soon the young lady would lose a tooth. Zenda sighed heavily and said that she must definitely tell the master about this. But at that very moment, Eika screamed in fear that this should not be done under any circumstances, because if her uncle found out, he would immediately pull out her tooth and start teasing her. The maid laughed quietly and apologized to her mistress, She added that it was almost a holiday, and the master would certainly be happy with such news. Aika understood perfectly well that everything would be completely different, so she insistently asked the maid not to say anything to her uncle. The maid reassured her and said that everything would definitely be fine, but the young lady knew her uncle too well and was sure that he would not miss the chance to laugh at her, so she decided that he should never know about this. After some time, they arrived at the museum, and the young lady quickly jumped out of the carriage, barely containing her joyful excitement. With a beaming smile, she rushed off to meet new adventures. However, after a few minutes, the girl stopped, noticing her friend ahead. He greeted her with a joyful smile, clearly pleased to meet her. Aika immediately grabbed his hands and delightedly declared that they hadn't seen each other for so long. Then she cheerfully complimented his beautiful outfit, and the boy thanked her for the compliment with a smile. Rospe looked at his friend with a gentle smile and slight embarrassment and said that she looked much nicer. Aika was very happy to hear this, and immediately sincerely thanked him for such kind words. After this, the young gentlemen greeted each other. Aika looked at her friend with an inspired smile and asked if he was ready for a real adventure. At that very moment, they both transformed, and the girl joyfully declared that now they needed to look for all the clues in the museum. The Marquise, in turn, looked at his niece with bewilderment, sincerely not understanding who she had grown up to be. So naive and a little stupid. He looked after them intently and sternly asked them not to get into trouble, to which the young friends immediately and hastily agreed. After some time, they entered the museum, and the young lady looked with delight at the many amazing things, because she had never seen anything like it before. Ruspe, meanwhile, began to tell her in detail about the painting they had just noticed, but a moment later, he noticed her gaze, and, with slight embarrassment, asked why she was looking at him with such admiration. The girl was surprised, because she did not understand how he knew so many details if there was not even a plaque next to the painting. Then the boy calmly explained that he had studied almost all of the museum exhibits in advance. Aika looked at her friend with sincere admiration, because he really knew a lot of interesting things. But a moment later, she was taken aback and confused when she saw her uncle between them. The Marquise looked coldly at the boy and told him to stay away from his niece. Then he reminded the girl that she herself said that she had no one but him. His gaze was too attentive, and he clearly understood that such closeness was still too early for them. The young people sighed heavily, because sometimes it seemed to them that the adult here was not the Marquise at all, but they themselves. After some time, they continued to explore the museum. They looked at each exhibit with genuine admiration, as if they were discovering a whole new world. The friends happily studied the unusual treasures and listened to amazing stories about them, while the young lady secretly looked at things that could be useful to her in the future. After a while, Aika, with a joyful smile, admitted that she had a lot of fun, especially when he explained everything so interestingly. Ruspe, in response, said with a smile that the museum really does hold many amazing things, but suddenly, the young lady froze in place from an unexpected shock. She reached out her hand to the shiny, beautiful horseshoe and suddenly felt a strange desire to take it with her. At that very moment, a cold fear gripped her. The girl was shocked because she clearly felt someone's presence nearby. Aika turned around sharply because she suddenly realized that there was a hunter somewhere nearby. Her body began to tremble because she felt that he was very close, and she needed to leave quickly before he found them. The Marquise looked at his niece in bewilderment and asked why she had suddenly stopped so abruptly. Aika looked at her family with a calm smile and said that she was just thinking for a while, because she was sure that everything would be fine, because she was able to change the future. The Marquise looked closely at his niece and reminded her that she shouldn't lag behind, since just recently she herself said that she wanted to buy a souvenir. Aika quietly called out to her friend because she felt that a hunter was lurking somewhere nearby, but she decided that it was better to simply avoid him. With an innocent smile, she said that she would go to the toilet for a short while and asked them to wait for her. The Marquis frowned slightly because he really didn't want to let his niece go alone. However, the girl only joyfully assured him that she would be fine and would return soon, and then asked her uncle to buy her a horseshoe. The Marquise was stunned by her sudden request and strange behavior, but he did not have time to say anything because Aika suddenly jumped up and quickly ran away. He sighed heavily and looked after her for a long time, amazed at how fast she was. A moment later, the Marquis turned his gaze in surprise to the small horseshoe and did not understand when his niece had even managed to notice it. Moreover, he saw that the museum was full of much more beautiful and expensive exhibits, but for some reason, she chose the ugliest one. Ruspe looked cautiously at the Marquis and quietly said that he would also like such a horseshoe. The Marquis was even more surprised, because it turned out that the boy suddenly liked this strange and, in his opinion, ugly thing. But a moment later, he looked closely at the cunning little boy and realized that he was clearly up to something. At that very moment, the Marquis looked into the distance in surprise, because he heard a familiar voice. He sighed heavily and greeted the Duke, whom he had not seen for a long time, in a reserved manner. The Duke calmly approached and returned their greeting with a polite smile. The next moment, he noticed with a slight grin that today he did not see the Marquis's niece nearby, whom he had been so concerned about lately. The Marquis immediately frowned and asked with obvious irritation what relation his niece had to him at all. The Duke merely turned away and smiled carelessly, saying that it was none of his business, but merely simple curiosity. Then he calmly added that it was time for him to leave on business, so they would see each other next time, although he would still like to meet the Marquis's niece. The Marquis looked coldly after him and dryly remarked that he would wait and see if they had a reason to meet again. He was very puzzled and did not understand what the Duke was doing in the museum, because he seemed to him to be a slippery and unpleasant person who only spoiled his mood. After some time, the young lady returned to her family and was surprised to see them calmly eating ice cream. Kassel looked at his niece in surprise and mockingly asked if she had fallen asleep in the toilet, since he was already ready to send divers after her. Eika timidly admitted that she was a little lost and then curiously asked where her ice cream was. Ruspe happily handed her the ice cream and said that he had specially taken one for her. The girl accepted the treat with a grateful smile and sincerely thanked him. The Marquis looked closely at his niece and asked if she had accidentally forgotten anything. Aika was taken aback, and then suddenly cried out that she had completely forgotten about the souvenir. For a while, she looked at the horseshoe in surprise, because in her eyes, it shimmered strangely. The girl thought and quietly asked herself if the future had really changed. At that moment, she flinched because her friend called her. Ruspe said with a joyful smile that he had had a lot of fun today, and he would like to invite her to play somewhere again next time. Aika responded with the same joyful smile and said that she would look forward to this meeting. The next day, the girl looked at her friend with a thoughtful smile. Serpens cheerfully noted that at this rate, her owner would soon wear a hole in the horseshoe. Aika quietly laughed and said that this was impossible, because the horseshoe was very strong. Serpens sighed and admitted that she still regretted a little that they hadn't managed to find the artifacts in the museum. She added that she hadn't expected it to be so easy. Aika just smiled and said that she was still glad to receive such a cool souvenir. A moment later, she looked at the door because her teacher had already arrived. The man said with a smile that he had prepared study material for her for today, based on the previous test. He added that she could practice by copying words from the book into a notebook. The young lady readily agreed and immediately set to work, quietly humming a cheerful song to herself. The teacher looked at her attentively and suddenly said that he had heard that her mother and the emperor had once been very close. Aika smiled calmly and replied that they were indeed friends. Then the man asked if she had ever met the emperor in person. She felt a strange anxiety and could not understand why he was asking her such things. Deep down, Aika felt some kind of cold and ominous energy coming from him. The girl looked at him in bewilderment, because she didn't understand why he was asking such a question. Aika stared at the teacher for a moment, her heart beating fast, and she didn't know what to answer. At that moment, she noticed her friend, who nodded and quietly indicated that she needed to answer. The girl sighed heavily, her voice trembling as she admitted that she had never seen the emperor. The man raised an eyebrow in surprise and asked if she had never even received a letter. Aika looked down, her insides aching with awkwardness, and she said that this had not happened. The conversations about her mother had nothing to do with the lesson, and she didn't understand why the teacher was so persistently interested in it. The man shook his head thoughtfully, noting that there was less interest in her answers than he had expected. He turned to the girl again, and she felt irritated. Her clenched fists trembled. She looked straight into the teacher's eyes, trying to maintain internal fortitude. The man was taken aback, lost his vigilance, And at that moment, Aika accidentally hit him with her hand and hit him right in the eye. He raised his eyebrows slightly and noted that it was not directly related to studies, but talking was part of the process. He then carefully asked if she had attended any events, to which Aika timidly answered no. The teacher turned away, sighing heavily, thinking that better late than never, and there was nothing shameful in it. The girl looked at him in bewilderment, her heart beating faster, not understanding what was wrong with this. He smiled softly, emphasizing that as a reliable mentor, he was ready to listen to her about everything. Serpens immediately hissed that he was talking a lot of nonsense, but she wanted to know when the real school would begin. Soon the man came out into the corridor, sighing heavily. Working with children is not easy, especially with children like Aika. He was glad that the Marquise had no idea about their plans, because he wanted to find evidence that the girl was the emperor's illegitimate child. He understood that as soon as this was confirmed, the man would recognize his merits. That same evening, Serpens shouted to Ayaka that she needed to warn the adults, as the teacher looked very suspicious. Aika smiled, but her heart was pounding, trying to calm the snake. Suddenly, something perceptibly shook around, and the conversation was cut off. The young lady was frozen with anxiety. She rushed to her friend to see if she felt the same. Aika was shocked. The sound of hooves could be heard. Perhaps her uncle had arrived. Serpens quietly noted that from such a distance, nothing could be heard. The girl put her thoughts aside and quietly went to bed, her heart trembling. In her dream, she saw a horse racing straight towards her, its hooves thundering, its breathing quickening. Aika opened her eyes abruptly, feeling someone's presence. Goosebumps ran down her spine. She darted lightning fast towards the horseshoe next to her, and it began to glow with a bright light. Joy filled her. She heard the magical sound of the relic. She immediately woke up Serpens. The snake was stunned. Light and powerful energy emanated from the horseshoe. The relic came to life. It took her breath away. Serpens noted that they could try to awaken the relic, but Aika was hesitant. She needed to know its true name. The snake added that if they went to the archives, they would find at least an approximate name. The young lady felt an emptiness in her chest. Would her uncle let her go? Fear and excitement were mixed. Serpens assured him that he would let go. This was their first discovery. She would be able to awaken the horse. Aika screamed, feeling someone's presence nearby. A chill ran down her spine. She turned around and saw her uncle. He was looking at her with bewilderment, surprise frozen in his gaze. Aika looked at her uncle in surprise, her heart trembling with morning excitement. She timidly asked if he had already returned. The Marquise took his niece in his arms, and his voice was a mixture of sternness and concern. If she stayed up late, she would not have time to grow up and would turn into a thin twig. Aika was taken aback and objected that she was growing well and was already taller than her friend. The Marquis sighed heavily, but with a smile, he declared that whether he was a little taller or a little shorter, nuts would still be nuts. A moment later, he looked at his niece in bewilderment, and Aika felt how everything inside was overflowing with excitement and curiosity. She timidly asked if she could ask for something. The Marquise sighed heavily and suggested that she wanted to talk about the imperial palace again. Aika was taken aback, not understanding how he had guessed. He calmly noted that she had been talking about him all the time, and Aika admitted with a smile that she really wanted to go there and asked him to accompany her. A moment later, the Marquis sighed even more deeply and said that she could take a quick peek at something. They headed to the dungeon, and the young lady was trembling with impatience, expecting boring places. But suddenly, she saw a bright light. Aika froze for a moment, amazed by the beauty and grandeur of what she saw. She curiously asked her uncle if he was building a secret base. The Marquis sighed with a slight smile and explained that this was simply a teleportation artifact that allowed one to go directly to the archive. He added that now she wouldn't interfere with his visits to the palace. Aika was truly shocked. It was incredible and unexpected. The Marquis warned that one prohibition would not stop her, and if she disobeyed, she would pester her grandfather until he gave in. He advised her to be careful and use teleportation, noting that it was a gift from him and the emperor. Aika was amazed and filled with joy. She did not expect that the emperor would give her such a miracle. The Marquis sighed heavily, explaining that a lot of effort had gone into creating the artifact. At that moment, Aika, beaming with happiness, hugged her uncle and, with a smile, admitted that he was the best, and also said that she loved him. She sighed heavily, and added with a smile that she would definitely obey him from now on. Kassel watched his niece with a tender smile, understanding that everything he had done was for her safety and happiness. A few days ago, the emperor, looking at his friend, felt a chill of alarm and declared that someone had taken aim at his niece. The Marquis sighed heavily, tension squeezing his chest, and admitted that this was indeed the case. He first remembered the carriage accident when Aika was riding with his sister, and his heart sank at the memory of that day. Then, the attack on his father's estate came to light, and the weight of it weighed on him, making him realize the threat in its full scope. The emperor, with fury, clenched fists, and a glint in his eyes, declared that the imperial language teacher had recently died in an accident, and this loss only strengthened his resolve. He spoke of his promise to his friend, but for the girl's safety, he decided to speed up the installation of the teleportation artifact so that in case of any danger, she could instantly escape to the palace. The emperor looked closely at his friend, his eyes shining with anxiety and determination, and asked what he thought about this matter. Aika, her eyes shining, stared at the artifact, full of delight and impatience. Her heart was pounding wildly, and a spark of hope ignited in her chest. Would it really be possible to get into the archive? The Marquis sighed heavily. A mixture of concern and seriousness flashed across his face, and confirmed that everything was so. A moment later, he announced that it was too late, and the training would have to be postponed until tomorrow. The girl sighed heavily, disappointment pressing on her chest, but she nodded and agreed, deciding to wait. The next day, the Marquis patiently showed his niece how to use the artifact. Every movement was precise, and Aika looked at his hands with admiration, seeing magic and power in every gesture. After the first manipulations, the teleporter started, and the young lady screamed in surprise. Laughter and surprise intertwined in her voice, and her heart began to beat wildly. Soon they were transported to the archives. Aika looked back, and with bated breath saw the emperor. Winchester greeted the girl with a smile, his eyes shining with warmth, and asked how she was doing. The emperor reported that he had heard how her uncle had looked after her with care, and assumed that everything had already been explained to him. Aika beamed with joy, smiled gratefully, and warmth spread through her chest. He smiled, stroking her head, and said that he made it so that she could come and go freely, look into the archive as she wished. Aika nodded happily, her heart fluttering with happiness. The emperor asked if she would spare him a little time during tea, as he would like to spend time with her and prepare her favorite delicacies. The young lady, with a joyful smile, assured him that she would be happy to, and gratitude filled her eyes. She looked at the exquisite desserts with admiration, her eyes sparkling, and her chest tickling with anticipation. Her smile was wide, and her voice quiet with gratitude. The emperor said with a slight smile that she could eat as much as she wanted, but noted that the girl had not taken one thing into account. Confusion and fear instantly washed over Aika when she felt that something was wrong in her mouth, and with tears in her eyes, she called out to the emperor. At that moment, she said in a trembling voice that she had blood in her mouth. Winchester's heart sank. He hadn't expected this. He cried out to the servants to call the palace physician, but Aika stopped him with a decisive gesture. He rushed to the girl, as he was worried about her condition. With a heavy sigh and a trembling voice, the girl explained that it was not because of the cookies, but because a tooth had fallen out. Winchester was taken aback. His breath caught. He expected something different. And then he sighed heavily and gently offered the handkerchief, asking forgiveness for the fright. He suggested calling his uncle, as he knew the Marquise would be happy about this. But Aika stopped him with determination. No one should know. She knew she had to destroy the evidence. The emperor, seeing her firmness, nevertheless asked her to calm down and offered to carefully help with the tooth. The girl trustingly handed the tooth to the emperor, asking him not to show it to the Marquise. He agreed with a smile and sent her to the infirmary. After some time, the Marquise informed the emperor of his return. Surprise gave way to curiosity, since Aika had not been to the palace for a long time. On the way, the Marquis showed his niece interesting places, and Aika watched the emperor closely and said goodbye, hiding her excitement and joy from the meeting. The Marquis looked at her in bewilderment, not understanding why his niece was in such a hurry. Her eyes were shining, her heart was fluttering, and her soul was drawn to an adventure in the palace. The emperor looked at his friend with a gentle smile, his eyes sparkling with curiosity, and declared that he had something for him. He handed the Marquis a small pouch containing the secret, adding that, although he had agreed to keep it a secret, concealing it would have been practically criminal. The Marquise blinked in confusion, not understanding the fuss. At this time, the young lady was riding in the carriage, looking out the window with trepidation, humming a cheerful song that reflected her joyful excitement. As soon as they arrived at the estate, Aika instantly jumped out of the carriage and rushed to her room, her heart beating fast with anticipation. The Marquise watched his niece in surprise, his eyes searching for something unusual in her movements, and he quietly wondered if he was imagining things or if she really was lisping. The young lady collapsed onto the bed with a thud, relief mixed with fatigue. She knew she had changed her outfit, written a letter, and now she could just rest. But a moment later, her smile flashed again when the snake turned to her and informed her that it was time for the experiment. Aika nodded with shining eyes, because they had found the names in the archive, and now they had to check everything. She took the horseshoe and the list of names, her breathing quickening, her heart beating in time with her excitement. As she began to list all the names, she felt a mixture of anxiety and delight. Serpens looked at her hostess in bewilderment and suggested that the problem might be in her pronunciation. Aika was at a loss, internally worrying whether she would be able to summon a new friend, and at that very moment, she screamed, calling out one of the names. Serpens sighed heavily, thinking that there would be no reaction, but soon their hearts jumped in surprise. The horseshoe began to glow with a bright light. Aika froze for a moment. Shock and delight filled her at the same time. She did not expect such a miracle. Moments later, the young lady gazed in admiration at the beautiful horse, the third relic shining with majesty and energy. But suddenly, her delight turned to amazement when the horse spoke mockingly, declaring that the whole situation was a complete disappointment. His words stung Aika, who had tried to pronounce his name correctly, but her missing tooth was making it difficult. She was taken aback and timidly admitted that she had wanted to do everything right. The horse sighed deeply, as if resigned, and with a slight smile thanked her for the release, as if forgiving a small mistake. Ekus, beaming with joy, declared that he must repay the kindness, and lifted the young lady high into the air, causing her delight and slight fear. Aika screamed in surprise, her heart pounding, but deep down she was happy, because flying so high was incredibly exciting. A moment later, she was confidently riding a horse. The wind was blowing on her face, and a mixture of trepidation, fear, and joy was mixed in her chest. The feeling of flying was amazing. After some time, Aika returned to her room, and the horse, beaming with energy, said with a smile that he had just warmed up, as if promising new adventures. The girl sighed heavily, but her eyes sparkled with delight, and she promised herself that next time she would definitely ride with him again. Ekus, with his nose in the air, looked at the young lady with interest, asking her name and wanting to know how she would rate a ride on his beautiful back. Aika thought for a moment, looking at the shining horse in confusion, not knowing what to answer. After a moment, she admitted that his back was stronger than she expected, but the height scared her a little, and the fur in the moonlight seemed simply magical. She noted with admiration how gracefully he ran. Ekus smiled, noticing her delight, and said that she understood beauty, and he himself felt cool and handsome. The young lady curiously inquired about his strength, to which the horse, with slight bewilderment, was surprised that she still had not understood. He could appear anywhere in an instant. Aika explained that her snake could become invisible, and she was curious about what Ekus could do. He gently noted that invisibility was a piece of cake for him, but with her current capabilities, he would only be able to fade slightly from sight. He looked at Aika with a smile and said that since they had exchanged pleasantries, he would return back to the horseshoe, but she could call him at any time. Aika was surprised by his quick reaction, but Serpens calmed her down, noticing that she had found another artifact and praised her owner for her incredible abilities. The next day, the Marquis carefully read the letter from the Emperor. Gerard watched his master with a smile, guessing the contents of the bag he held in his hands. The Emperor explained that inside was Aika's baby tooth. He asked the Marquis to carefully monitor his niece to avoid problems if the molar grew incorrectly. After reading the letter, the Marquis thought for a moment. Gerard looked at the gentleman with a smile, waiting for further action. Kaysel then realized with fury that he needed to find his niece immediately, since she had managed to hide such an important event from him. He ordered his subordinate to use preservation magic on the tooth and make sure the girl ate only soft food. After some time, The young man returned along the corridor. When he noticed the maid, he hurried to her. Then he called his sister and hugged her tightly. Zenda grumbled that he shouldn't treat her like that at work, but she didn't thank him, which surprised and left him slightly shocked. She curiously asked if this concerned the attackers on the Duke's estate, and he confirmed that he had reached their leader. A moment later, Gerard showed her Aika's baby tooth, who happily admitted that she hadn't expected it to fall out so quickly, as the tooth had been loose for a long time. He added that the Marquise was aware of it, but pretended not to notice, although he was very angry when he learned about everything from the Emperor. Zenda remarked with a smile that when the Marquis was angry, he looked like a dog, which caused everyone to laugh lightly. Zenda looked at her brother with a smile and quietly decided that for such an occasion, she should prepare something special. Meanwhile, the man was seething with rage, his anger at the Duke literally bursting out. He didn't even bother to visit the Charity Council, and now he opened an academy. He was eager for his subordinate to stop any construction of a valuable facility, and this time, he had to make sure no one caught them. He sighed heavily, realizing that the Duke having his own place could play into their hands. But the anger from the failed attack did not subside. The girl was safe under impregnable protection. A moment later, the man informed the gentleman that a package had arrived. From the stamp, he realized that the trading company had sent it as a token of gratitude for the latest deal. The joy quickly turned to surprise when he opened the box and saw many heads in the white snake. He was stunned, unable to believe his eyes, and immediately shouted to his subordinate to immediately find out who dared to send such a thing. They found a letter in the box. The Marquis wrote that he received the gift sent that same night, and in response sent the head of their owner, warning that they should watch their necks especially carefully. The man was amazed by the Marquis' impudence, not expecting such audacity. Meanwhile, the Marquis, standing at the window, watched what was happening with interest. He was curious whether the man had opened his gift. After some time, the young lady looked in surprise at the small gift hidden under her pillow. The maid said with a smile that it seemed the Tooth Fairy had visited her during the night. Aika was shocked. She saw the gift, but she could not understand how the fairy found out about the lost tooth, because so few people knew about it. Zenda said with a smile that there was nothing the fairies didn't know, and this time they had taken her old tooth. A new one would grow soon. The young lady was frightened and worried, thinking that the fairy might have told her uncle, but the maid reassured her, assuring her that the fairy had come at night and the master had not found out anything. Aika asked the maid to keep everything a strict secret until she herself informed her uncle. At that moment, the young lady ran into another room. Zenda wondered if she and her brother had really wasted the evening trying to cheer up the lady about losing a tooth. Sometime later, the young lady happily ran to her uncle, calling him, but suddenly came to her senses. She was lisping. She sighed heavily, realizing that she couldn't enter into conversation with him. The Marquis called his niece, and she greeted him in return. He asked if it was hard for her to hold her hands for so long, as they might get tired. But Aika said that it didn't hurt at all, and that she was just doing exercises. The Marquis realized she wasn't going to tell the truth, and came closer. Smiling, he informed her that she had received a letter from the White Nut. The young lady was shocked. She hadn't expected her friend to write to her. A moment later, she was taken aback. She suddenly realized that she had made a mistake, and her uncle saw her lost tooth. The Marquis asked if she really thought that he would not notice the gap between her teeth. The young lady was taken aback and burst into bitter tears, not understanding how her uncle had found out about this, since the fairy and the emperor had promised to keep the secret. He said with a smile that it seemed to him as if the tooth had popped out on its own. Aika looked at him timidly, not knowing whether she should tell him everything. The Marquis stroked her head and asked if it hurt when the tooth fell out. She looked at him in surprise and asked with slight anger if he was going to tease her. Having collected her thoughts, Aika declared that it did not hurt at all. He smiled and said that it was very good. The Marquis was a little worried about how she would eat, but a moment later, Aika began to eat and declared that she ate everything very well. Kaso looked at his niece with a smile and asked her not to rush so that her stomach wouldn't hurt. A moment later, he was taken aback, remembering the newspaper collage his niece had made. There were suspicious details: a woman replaced by a man, one person by three. He realized that his niece had been hiding this and suffering alone. A moment later, a maid entered Aika's room and announced that she had brought her something that could make her happy. Aika looked at the maid with joy, as she brought her wonderful delicacies, and also a letter from a friend. She took the letter with a joyful smile, as it had a pleasant aroma. Zenda informed the lady that she had finished the thing she had previously assigned her. She presented the young lady with a beautiful horseshoe necklace. Aika was incredibly happy and thanked the servant. But a moment later, she read the letter and her face changed. The maid looked at her in surprise and asked if everything was okay. Aika said that she would not be able to meet her friend for a while, as he was going with his father to the estate. Aika looked tenderly at the letter containing the flowers and assumed it must have taken him some time to dry them. She was pleasantly surprised that he made them with his own hands. Zenda said with a smile that the gift was filled with sincerity, and the young lady should keep the flowers so that they would not be damaged. Aika wanted to give her friend a gift in return, and the maid offered her a fur scarf or hat. Aika knew that a white or purple hat would suit him. At the same time, she understood that when he returned, they would make a herbarium together. She was looking forward to their meeting. Serpens, looking at her friend, said that they needed to train. She was seething with rage, realizing that the girl had a lot to learn and that she would have to put all her sweet worries aside. Serpens stated that there were some matters in which a young lady should not interfere. She said that the girl was not yet capable of using her full potential, and if she got hung up on the little things, she would miss the important ones. Serpens admonished her, and Aika sighed heavily, realizing that her friend only wanted the best for her. Serpens explained that she would choose which things Aika would see. She added forcefully that the girl should give a sign if her uncle was in danger, since she had come to the estate to save him. Aika smiled and said that she would protect the people she loved and those her mother held dear. She looked at the snake with a smile and asked it to bend its tail and make a promise. She thought that her friend would keep her word. But, unfortunately, after some time, her uncle found himself in danger, and she was not warned. Aika looked at the snake in shock and asked what she meant. When she said that if her uncle got hurt, she shouldn't be surprised. Serpens stated that he would not die. He would just be slightly injured. The young lady was shocked. She screamed furiously at the snake, saying that it was a deceiver, because they had agreed that it would help protect her uncle. Gerard slowly walked out of the master's room and froze for a moment, as a young lady crashed into him and fell to the ground with a crash. He reached out to her and asked if she was okay. Aika again anxiously asked Gerard where her uncle was, because she knew that he should have returned long ago. Gerard was taken aback and embarrassedly asked the lady for forgiveness. He explained that the gentleman had not yet arrived, and that, more importantly, it was time for Miss to go to bed, so he wanted to escort her to the room. Aika was worried because she knew that he had left with his uncle, but for some reason he had returned alone. She noticed the strange expression on Gerard's face when he tried to lie, and she immediately realized that he was hiding the truth about her uncle. Then the young lady flushed and declared that he should forget everything, since she intended to find her uncle herself. The young man was at a loss and didn't have time to stop her. Aika learned that her uncle had already returned home and immediately headed to his office. So, overcome with anxiety, she hurried straight to his office. But upon opening the door, the young lady froze in place, seeing her uncle in front of her. The Marquis, not paying attention to the guest, asked if his niece was sleeping. He ordered Gerard not to let her up to the second floor and to bring more bandages. But a moment later, the Marquis was taken aback when he heard the familiar voice of his niece. He quickly approached her and froze for a moment, noticing that she was crying bitterly. He was confused and asked why she was not sleeping, and then told her to go to bed immediately. At that moment, Aika noticed the blood and began to cry even harder. She screamed desperately that he was in pain, and he assured her that everything was fine. He was amazed because she cried as if he was on the verge of death. Then the Marquis carefully took his niece in his arms and began to calm her down, noticing with a gentle smile that her eyes would soon be swollen from tears. Aika sighed heavily and said with resentment that he shouldn't laugh at her and that he should let her go because his hand was wounded. The Marquis calmly assured her that he was not in any pain and that he was not going to die, so she should not worry so much. Aika reached out to her uncle and quietly called him, still worried and confused. A moment later, a young man came into the office and asked the Marquis in surprise if he really had that same niece in his arms. Aika looked at the stranger in bewilderment and tried to understand who he was. He looked at the young lady with a friendly smile and greeted her warmly. Then the young man came closer and gently stroking her head, was surprised how such a sweet girl could be a relative of the stern marquise. He asked her age with a curious smile. Aika sighed heavily and admitted she was 7, and he noted with a satisfied expression that he had thought so. Suddenly, the young man became embarrassed and admitted that he had completely forgotten his manners, after which he introduced himself as Count Baron de Lamont. Aika looked at him in bewilderment, because she didn't know that her uncle had friends, and his last name seemed strangely familiar to her. The young man gently explained that he and the marquise were old friends, so she could simply call him Uncle. Aika looked at him carefully, and carefully called him Uncle Baron. The Count was taken aback by the unexpected warmth of her sweet address, and could not understand how his friend had hidden such a charming niece. Aika watched the young man closely, remembering her mother's words about how there were many good people in this house, although this uncle seemed a little strange to her. Aika anxiously asked the Count if he was wounded, but he, with a slight smile, assured her that everything was fine, explaining that he and the Marquise had only been fooling around and, out of old friendship, had engaged in a duel, which he had been lucky enough to win. The young lady objected hotly, for it was unthinkable to her that her uncle, so strong and invincible, could lose. The Count merely sighed and admitted that, despite everything, he had still managed to make it to Ella's banquet. The young lady looked at him in surprise, not understanding who he was talking about. He gently explained with a smile that Ella was his younger sister. He also noted that the young lady must have seen her at the ball, since they were even introduced to each other. Aika realized that they were talking about a beautiful lady she had once met, and the Count smiled contentedly, confident that his sister would like such a memory. The Marquise looked coldly at his friend and dryly made it clear that if the conversation was over, he had better leave immediately. Aika looked closely at the Count and invited him to stay the night, since there were so many rooms in the house. The Marquise immediately asked who had allowed her to manage his house, and she innocently explained that she was not renting it out at all, but only borrowing it. The Count watched their lively verbal altercation with genuine bewilderment. A moment later, the young lady cried out loudly, unexpectedly putting an end to their argument. The Marquise was amazed, but at the same time noticed that his niece had a surprisingly accurate sense of the moment when it was necessary to intervene. He sighed heavily and admitted with a soft smile that one night would not change anything, and the Count looked at the girl with admiration, suddenly thinking that he himself would like to have such a niece. The next day, they had a calm and even warm conversation over the morning meal. The Count looked at the young lady with a smile and asked if she had lost her appetite, but Aika assured him that everything was very tasty. In fact, she was sad that her friend had not shown up, and deep down she was still a little angry with her. The Marquise looked closely at his niece and reminded her that it was time to stop daydreaming and focus on the upcoming trip. Aika looked at him in bewilderment, but he immediately reminded her that it was she who had long persuaded him to go to the house where she once lived with her mother. After some time, the young lady was incredibly happy at the thought of returning to her home and quietly hoped that everything there remained the same as before. Castle, with a gentle smile, assured her that everything in the house was preserved as if she had never left, because he had kept a close eye on it and had not allowed even a speck of dust to appear. He noticed her large bag with curiosity and assumed that she was going to take a whole mountain of toys from the house. Aika nodded, although in fact she wanted to find things related to the relic. After some time, the young lady finally arrived at her home and looked at the familiar building with admiration. She walked leisurely through the rooms of her home. At the same time, she enjoyed every moment, because she found herself again in the place where she once lived next to her mother. But suddenly, the young lady was taken aback by hearing a painfully familiar voice. In front of her stood the manager of the Roa estate. Aika joyfully rushed to her, because she was immensely happy to see her again, and Roa was sincerely glad to see the young lady alive and well. Aika enthusiastically asked her friend about her affairs, because she once thought that they would never meet again. Roa, with a warm smile, said that now everything was different, and she had been waiting for her return for a long time. Aika happily chirped that she had grown taller and even lost a tooth, but a moment later, their animated conversation died down when they noticed the approaching Marquise. The Marquis watched them with a satisfied smile, enjoying this warm meeting. Roa greeted him respectfully and admitted that it was a great honor for her to meet him in person for the first time. Aika was surprised to learn that her friend knew her uncle. Roa explained with a smile that they corresponded, and the Marquis often told her about the young lady's affairs. Aika was stunned that her uncle was sharing information about her, and secretly hoped that he was not talking about her pranks. The Marquis sighed heavily and asked if everything was ready, and Roa calmly replied that all the things had long been packed into boxes. Aika looked at them in surprise, but the Marquis dryly remarked that she didn't need to know about this at all. She flushed with indignation because this was her home. The Marquis looked closely at his niece and reminded her that it was she who had allowed the Baron to manage his house yesterday. Aika objected that she had only given a room to a guest. The Marquis sighed wearily and said that she shouldn't get hung up on every little thing, because now she could do whatever she wanted. Aika sighed heavily and thought resentfully that her uncle was incredibly greedy. A moment later, the young lady abruptly pulled away from her uncle and ran off to do her own thing. Entering the room, she froze for a moment, seeing that everything remained exactly the same as before. She froze in front of her mother's portrait, once again convinced of what an incredible beauty her mother was. Aika remembered the moment when her mother, with a playful smile, asked her if she thought she was the coolest. Then, little Ayaka enthusiastically assured that her mother was the coolest in the world. Syria looked seriously at her daughter and said that if she loved her so much, then she should look at the painting and patiently wait for her return. Aika's face filled with tears, as the longing for her mother gripped her heart with renewed strength. But a moment later, the young lady took a deep breath and tried to calm down when she heard a familiar voice. Serpents immediately loudly declared to the snake that they had not yet made peace and that she should not talk to her. Serpents sighed heavily and asked the young lady for forgiveness. With tears in her eyes, the snake admitted that she had acted recklessly and sincerely regretted what had happened. Then the young lady also apologized for her outburst of anger, because it seemed to her that something terrible had happened to her uncle, and after a moment, they finally made peace. After some time, the young lady entered her mother's room and was amazed by the impeccable order, which she had never seen before. Aika happily examined every corner of her mother's room, and with warm nostalgia remembered what she once did here with her. A moment later, she wondered where her mother could have hidden the relic. A few minutes later, she suddenly cried out in guess, realizing that she needed to look not in her mother's room, but in her own. An image of a mother with a gentle smile, suggesting to her daughter that they practice playing hide-and-seek in advance, came to mind. Aika realized that if her mother had left her something important, she would have hidden it in the same place as her grandfather, and so she hurried to the closet. A moment later, her fingers found a small box. Memories came flooding back, and Aika's eyes filled with tears when she saw her favorite yellow ribbon and realized that her mother had left these things to her. She sighed heavily and tried to hold back her tears, remembering the promise she had made to her mother not to cry. A moment later, she turned to her friend and said that it was time for them to go back. Aika was sure that her mother had left many useful things for her, so she decided to open them calmly when she returned to the estate. Meanwhile, the Duke looked closely at his son and coldly reminded him that he had only allowed him to meet his girlfriend under special circumstances. He then sternly added that the boy should stay away from the young lady. The Duke looked closely at his son and asked if he understood his words, but Rusp stood frozen in a daze, unable to utter a word. The young man was shocked to the depths of his soul and could not understand why his father suddenly started talking about this. After all, they had previously discussed something completely different, but the Duke calmly explained that circumstances had changed greatly. He sighed heavily and said that rumors were already spreading among the nobles that his son was deeply infatuated with a young lady of unknown origin and was even preparing for an engagement. Hearing this, Rusp froze in place, amazed by such words. After a moment, he looked away in embarrassment and quietly remarked that there had never been any talk of an engagement, since there had never been such a relationship between them. The Duke sighed again and said that things might have turned out differently if the Duchess's status had been officially announced, but participating in gossip would only do harm, so it was better to be careful. He came closer to his son and sternly reminded him that he was the only heir to the imperial throne. The Duke added gravely that the heir must act impeccably, hiding any weaknesses, and he hoped that his son understood the meaning of these words. After some time, the Duke stood silently at the window, thoughtfully looking into the distance and reflecting on the current situation. Rosacea sighed heavily and admitted that she was very worried about her son, because after he began training as his heir, his smile became rare and fleeting. She understood that even at his age, a child needs to play and enjoy life, so she felt like they were putting too much on him. The Duke sighed again and said quietly that for now this was the best they could do for him. He explained that the nobility needed to be kept in check and the imperial family supported, and therefore his son's position needed to be strengthened to protect him. Madame understood this, but was still happy when she saw how her son became more animated after meeting his little friend. With a slight smile, she noted that recently they had even begun exchanging letters. Looking at her husband, the madam added that the girl had been in hiding for many years, because her family had also been cautious. The Duke allowed his son to maintain this friendship, wanting to fulfill his childhood wish, but much in this story still left him doubtful. He understood that both their families had protected the imperial family for many years, but until his son became an adult and could stand up for himself, he had to remain under strict training. Sometime later, the young man received a letter from his girlfriend. In the letter, she thanked him for the gift and wrote that she also sent him a small present, a purple fur cape. He thought for a moment, realizing that if he had known about this in advance, he would have definitely tried to meet her before leaving. Rusby sighed heavily and looked thoughtfully into the distance, because he already missed his friend and wanted to know what she was doing now. Meanwhile, the Marquise looked intently at his niece and demanded that she open her mouth immediately. Aika, with tears in her eyes, obediently opened her mouth and showed that she had lost another tooth. The Marquise remarked with a satisfied grin that at this rate she would soon be left without any teeth at all, and the girl screamed in horror that new ones would grow in their place. In a burst of joy, she suddenly exclaimed that she would ask the tooth fairy to give her a beautiful new tooth. The Marquise sighed heavily and remarked mockingly that she was too much trouble and that they might even have to bribe the tooth fairy. Aika indignantly shouted that this was not the way to act, because she would behave well and then everything would definitely work out. The Marquis, leaving with a smile, asked her not to cross the tooth fairy, and the girl, amazed by his words, shouted after him that she would sort everything out herself. The young man then announced that he was going to visit the new academy and asked his niece if she would like to go with him, adding that she could visit her grandfather at the same time. Aika asked her uncle with a smile if she could take her friend with her when he returned. The Marquise noted with bewilderment that she should first ask Whitenut's opinion. The girl confidently declared that he would definitely agree, and the Marquise ironically noted that she should not intimidate the boy, because he even felt sorry for him. The young lady flushed with indignation and immediately attacked her uncle, because she had never threatened her friend. After some time, Aika asked her friend in surprise if she understood what exactly was lying in front of them. Serpent suggested that it might be some kind of code. Aika began to read the document, but quickly became confused, as the meaning of what was written remained vague for her. She noticed on the paper the family crests that her mother had once mentioned, but everything else was completely incomprehensible to her. The girl looked at the sheet of paper in confusion and didn't know where to begin searching for the solution. Suddenly, she noticed that the ring resembled the clues from the riddles she and her mother had found during treasure hunts. Aika remembered that back then, it was necessary to connect different signs and hints to find the hidden treasure. She knew that she had learned a lot from her mother and had gone on many treasure hunts with her, so she believed that she could solve this mystery too. Serpent sighed and advised her not to rush, as her abilities were unfolding gradually, drop by drop, showing her the right path. At that very moment, Ekos appeared in front of the young lady and with a smug smile, reminded her of his existence. He confidently stated that if she needed to go somewhere quickly and secretly, he would get her there in a matter of moments. Aika thanked her faithful steed with a grateful smile, and the snake looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he appeared even without a call. A few days later, the young maid worriedly asked her mistress if she thought everything that was happening was too dangerous. Zenda was sincerely worried that her mistress might get hurt, because for something like that, she could not only be scolded. Aika just smiled contentedly and confidently assured that everything was fine and she shouldn't worry at all. The young lady then turned her full attention back to the documents, realizing that she must patiently pore over them and solve the hidden riddle. During the day, she diligently trained her abilities together with her faithful snake, and in the evenings, she carefully studied the clues that her mother had once left for her. Whenever she needed to sneak into the archives late at night without her uncle's knowledge, her faithful horse would take her there with lightning speed and return her back just as quietly. But one day, The maid anxiously asked the young mistress if she thought all this was too dangerous. Zenda was truly frightened because she was afraid that the mistress might get hurt, and then she would not only be scolded, but also driven out of the estate. She begged the girl to change her mind, but the young lady resolutely explained that she had to finish the job because her friend was soon returning after a long absence, and she wanted to give him a gift made with her own hands. Zenda knew that embroidery could be dangerous for a child, so she suggested that the lady only choose the color and do all the work herself, which greatly surprised Aika. The girl immediately understood that this would no longer be their joint work. She looked closely at the maid and with an almost pleading look asked her for help. Zenda was shocked by this touching look and realized that she simply could not refuse the young lady. Then she carefully lifted the girl up and noted with a smile that it was a real fowl. She decided that they would embroider together, but under her strict control. A moment later, they had already begun to work. Meanwhile, the Marquis quietly watched them from the side. A touching picture appeared before his eyes. His niece was trying her best to carefully embroider a beautiful pattern on a scarf. This scene unexpectedly warmed his heart, and with a soft smile, he quietly left the room. A few minutes later, the young lady looked at the embroidered flower with admiration and realized with surprise that she had actually been able to make something similar. Then the maid looked closely at her mistress and said that she would carefully finish the rest of the embroidery herself. Aika was surprised to realize that she had not even noticed how skillfully Zenda worked. When the work was finished, Aika quickly ran to the table where the gift box lay. She carefully placed the handkerchief inside, afraid that it might get dirty on the way. A moment later, the girl carefully sealed the gift and looked into the distance with a dreamy smile, imagining her friend opening the box. Aika looked at the maid with hope and asked if her friend would like such a gift, and Zenda confidently answered with a warm smile that he would definitely appreciate it, because it was made from the heart. After some time, the young man returned to his home. The maid approached the gentleman respectfully and informed him that a letter and a gift had arrived for him from the Marquisate, carefully asking if he wanted to open them immediately. Ruspe calmly took the letter and immediately realized that it was from his girlfriend, assuming that she was inviting him to a meeting, which he was going to politely decline. However, after reading it, he froze in shock, not believing his eyes. Ruspe was shocked because the letter indicated that his always cheerful friend had become seriously ill. Meanwhile, the young lady returned to her room, wondering whether her friend had received the letter, and sadly realizing that they would not be able to see each other for the time being. But suddenly, all her thoughts were scattered when the maid ran in and excitedly announced that young Master Rusp had arrived to see her. It turned out that he was already standing at the main gate and waiting for permission to enter. Aika was shocked and did not expect such an unexpected visit at all. After some time, Ruspe finally visited his friend, but was noticeably puzzled by the fact that she had wrapped herself in a blanket and stubbornly did not come out to him. He sighed heavily and quietly called her, but there was no answer, and then the young man apologized for the sudden visit, explaining that he had been greatly alarmed by her letter and therefore had immediately hurried to her. The only thing that worried him was where exactly it hurt, because in the letter, she wrote that she was ill. The young lady, hearing this, froze in complete shock, realizing that she found herself in an extremely awkward position. She wrote her friend a similar letter, just to tell him not to come, but he rushed to her so quickly and so sincerely that she was completely at a loss. Aika was confused and at a loss, because she hadn't thought through what she would do if he did show up. The young man smiled softly and offered to read her a book, hoping to at least brighten her mood a little. However, the young lady hastened to assure him that she was fine and just wanted to rest a little. He sighed heavily again and thoughtfully asked what he should do for her to somehow ease her suffering. Aika was completely stunned because she didn't want to make him worry at all, but now she didn't know how to get out of this situation. Serpens quietly asked the young lady why she couldn't just be honest with her friend, since he really cared about her and would surely understand. Then Aika, gathering all her courage, finally decided to call her friend. She looked at him carefully and with a trembling heart asked for forgiveness, admitting that she had deceived him. Rusby looked at his friend in bewilderment, as he had absolutely no idea what she was talking about, and the young lady sheepishly asked him not to laugh at her. Then she hesitantly opened her mouth and asked if he noticed anything, to which the young man looked at her in confusion and tried to understand what she was talking about. The girl sighed heavily and admitted that she had actually lost several teeth and that she felt very embarrassed about it. Aika sheepishly explained that she only wanted to meet him when she got new teeth, which is why she wrote that strange letter. Rusp asked, stunned, if it hurt when they fell out. The girl replied with a soft smile that it didn't hurt. It just all felt a little unusual. Hearing this, he breathed a sigh of relief, and a warm, gentle smile appeared on his face, as if a heavy stone had been lifted from his heart. The young man admitted that he was glad to know that she didn't have any pain, and in response, he told her that he himself had once lost a tooth. Aika looked at him in surprise, since she had never noticed this before, but he calmly explained that it had happened a long time ago. Ruspe took his friend's hands with a gentle smile and made it clear that he understood her perfectly. But changing teeth was a completely natural thing that everyone goes through, and she shouldn't be embarrassed at all. He looked at her carefully and once again carefully asked if it was true that she hadn't been in pain. Aika timidly nodded and quietly assured him that everything was fine, while again asking him for forgiveness. After that, she sighed heavily and suddenly ran away from him. But a moment later, the girl ran up to her friend again and animatedly suggested they play, because since he was at her house, they could have a wonderful time together. Moreover, she enthusiastically invited him to stay the night. Ruspe was confused and did not know what to answer, because he had come secretly and understood that he would soon have to return home. He could not decide what to do. At that moment, the Marquise entered the room and calmly asked if they had finished their conversation. The young people froze in surprise, not expecting to see him here at all. The Marquise looked intently at the young man and called him sternly. His voice was serious when he stated that they needed to talk alone, and Ruspe was momentarily taken aback. After some time, they were already in the office, where the Marquis sighed heavily and calmly asked the young man if he had come here without permission. Rusp was taken aback, because he had not expected such a question at all. However, after a moment, he gathered his courage, sighed guiltily, and quietly said that he was very sorry, and that he would return home immediately. The Marquis sighed again and remarked that it was too late now, so the young man could stay at the estate. The young man was genuinely surprised by such an unexpected decision. The Marquis then explained that he had already contacted his father and arranged everything, so the boy had nothing to worry about. He understood perfectly well that the young man had rushed here out of concern for his girlfriend, and he wanted to thank him for such sincere concern. With a slight smile, he added that they could play as much as they wanted, and serious conversations could be left until tomorrow. Rusp thanked him for this permission with a joyful smile. After some time, a maid entered the room to the young gentleman and reminded them that it was time for them to go to bed. Aika was amazed because it seemed to them that they had only just begun to play. Zenda asked them with a kind smile if they liked the pajamas. The young people happily replied that they were very comfortable and warm. A moment later, the maid announced that she would leave a nightlight for them, so they should try to get some sleep. The children thanked her with grateful smiles and wished her good night. Aika turned to her friend and with a satisfied smile admitted that she had had a lot of fun. She even wistfully remarked that she wished he would come and play with her every day. Then the young lady curiously asked what he had been doing all this time while they were apart. The young man said with a smile that he had been looking around various properties, and at first he had been a little scared because he had never traveled so far. However, over time, everything turned out to be much more interesting than he had expected. He looked closely at his friend and with a warm smile hinted that one day he might take her with him on such a trip. But suddenly, he jumped onto the bed and screamed loudly. Aika looked at him in surprise, not understanding what had suddenly happened. At that very moment, the young man quickly ran away from her and asked her to wait a little. The girl watched in bewilderment as he ran to his backpack and began looking for something there. A moment later, he returned to her and called her with a joyful smile, wanting to give her a gift. Ruspe explained that he had intended to send the gift along with the letter, but since he had come in person, he decided to deliver it himself. Aika looked at the beautiful brooch with a beaming smile. The young man excitedly asked her if she liked the gift, since it was made by a famous craftsman from their family estate. He proudly explained that the brooch could be worn on clothing, on the neck or on the chest, and the ribbon could be changed if desired. Aika tried to attach the decoration to her clothing, but she had great difficulty doing so. Noticing this, The young man carefully offered to help. A moment later, he carefully secured the brooch, and the girl, with a joyful smile, asked if the gift suited her. Ruspi smiled warmly and confidently made it clear that the decoration suited her very well. He then gently added that there was another gift hidden inside the box, and she should definitely look. Eka hurried to open the box, burning with curiosity, but a moment later she froze in place, struck by the beauty of the magnificent bracelet. For some time, the young lady silently examined the decoration, because the small stone on it surprisingly reminded her of her friend's eyes. Ruspe watched Aika with a joyful smile, holding in his hands the bracelet of the Tannin tribe, shining with the mysterious northern light that promised good luck. He made it himself, putting hope and warmth into every curve, and excitedly imagined how the gift would delight the girl. Aika froze for a moment, struck by her friend's attention, feeling her heart slightly quicken from such care. Her joy soon flared up, and she thanked him with a sincere smile, promising to take care of the bracelet and never take it off. Ruspe quietly thanked him for the handkerchief he had received, feeling a thrill from the fact that the symbol of care remained in his sight. After some time, the young people settled into bed. The warm light of the lamp softly illuminated the room, creating an atmosphere of trust and comfort. Aika asked curiously if her friend was involved in magic, her eyes sparkling with interest and anticipation of a new discovery. Ruspe sighed heavily, admitting that there was no time for practice, but he was sincerely glad to have the opportunity to be near her. The girl said that real wizards once appeared in her estate, causing slight confusion and admiration. She asked questions about the future, about whether he could become like them, and there was a slight excitement and tender concern in her voice, Rusp thought, feeling a slight anxiety and sadness. But Aika's gaze filled him with confidence and a warm light. She reached closer to him, her presence like a comforting ray, warming his heart and soul, giving him a feeling of security. Aika made it clear with a soft smile that no matter who he became, she would always be there, her words full of sincerity and devotion. Ruspe was amazed. His heart was filled with surprise and joy. He felt something rare, complete trust and understanding from his friend. The girl asked him to try to sleep. Quiet laughter filled the room, and peace enveloped them like a soft blanket. Plucking up his courage, he carefully took her hand, experiencing a tender, trembling feeling, as if the world around him had frozen for a moment. Aika, slightly surprised, but without hesitation reciprocated, their hands joined, and a quiet, touching harmony reigned in the room. Rusp thanked her for her trust with a gentle smile, and for a moment a spark of joy flashed in both of their eyes, like a small miracle in their world. The next day, the young lady said goodbye to Rusp, her eyes shining with a slight sadness, and her heart aching at the thought of separation. He smiled as he said goodbye, but deep down, he felt the weight of the impending separation and the anticipation of a long wait. As soon as Rusp disappeared from sight, his face darkened, reflecting anxiety and the realization that he would now be lonely at home without his girlfriend. Upon returning to his home, he immediately heard that the Duke was waiting for him in his office, and his heart was filled with excitement and slight anxiety. Ruspe was upset by the need to immediately appear before his father, but he hurried, clenching his fists and trying to collect his thoughts. Entering the office, he saw the menacing silhouette of the Duke, whose seriousness and sternness immediately made him freeze in place. The Duke uttered one word, "Month!" and that moment stunned Rusp. He did not understand what the mysterious warning meant. The father explained that in a month he would be able to meet his girlfriend again, but for now he needed to avoid rumors and behave with dignity. The young man nodded in a trembling voice, but inside I felt a mixture of joy and anxiety, unable to fully understand my father's logic. Rusp did not understand his father's sudden change. The Duke reported that the Marquise had suggested the idea of holding a summer banquet. On this day, the young lady will be officially declared the heir. Ruspe froze, stunned by the news, his heart beating faster, because such events predicted serious changes in their lives. The next day, the Marquis handed Aika a letter, and she looked at the small envelope in bewilderment, not realizing that its contents were so important. It turned out to be an invitation to a reception, and the young lady felt her heart skip a beat in anticipation of new experiences. The Marquis noted that his niece had long been bored of being locked up, and she immediately agreed, her heart filled with slight excitement. Cassel added that they would go to the reception together with their grandfather, and also specified that the studio would select her outfit for the banquet. His eyes were shining with anticipation, because he knew that the day would come when his niece's name would shine for everyone, without a shadow of a doubt. The Marquise promised to assign her a personal night, and Aika happily asked questions, curiosity filling her, and her heart fluttering. He just smiled and said that she would find out everything tomorrow, and the girl could hardly contain her delight, anticipating the surprise. The next morning, she stood frozen, amazed by the sight of the knight, clad in armor from head to toe, whose menacing figure inspired awe and admiration at the same time. Aika was puzzled. Her heart beat faster, because she didn't know who was hiding behind the shiny armor, and a slight tremor ran through her body. The Great Summer Banquet was one of the greatest events of the empire, where all the aristocratic families gathered, and the atmosphere combined luxury and austerity. For Aika, who turned 7, this evening became not only a celebration, but also an important step in her future position in society. Kassel built up his niece's social security step by step, ensuring that every step strengthened her status and protected her from rumors. The debut ball was not only a charity evening, but also a strategic moment that was supposed to silence gossip and strengthen the girl's prestige. The young man was tormented by doubts about whether it was right to introduce Aika to society now, since she was still a child, but already showed unusual maturity. The young lady reminded him more and more of his sister, combining cunning, curiosity, and natural courage that surprised and alarmed him at the same time. He remembered how the faithful knight had been amazed at her ability to recognize her master's arrival and immediately head towards him, demonstrating amazing intuition. The Marquise was shocked when he realized that his niece already knew about the injury and the attack, although she had no way of knowing about it. Kassel understood that his knight would never lie about Aika's behavior, and was amazed at her ability to predict events, but he still understood that there was a limit. He remembered how she had come running with important documents about the thieves, showing determination and attention to detail, as if she knew how to resolve difficult situations after the attack on the Marquis' assistant. Her confidence and ability to act were impressive, as if she had already understood the consequences before they happened. Kassel was momentarily taken aback, comparing Aika with his sister, who also suddenly left and returned in disarray, seeming completely absorbed in her work. The memory of that same sister, who had once come home with a child in her arms and then died, filled him with trepidation and barely restrained anxiety. Aika's behavior both pleased and frightened him. Her courage, intelligence, and secrecy reminded him of a living thread of memory of his sister, and her intuition seemed supernatural. He never cared who Ayaka's real father was, because above all, he was concerned about the safety of his sister and niece. The more he delved into the memories of his sister's death, the more he felt that he had to look for the culprits and take a different look at her past. At this moment, the young lady, not expecting to see anyone, screamed and was taken aback, surprise clearly reflected on her sweet face. The young man watched her with a slight smile, trying to understand how much she liked his outfit, and she was pleased to hear a familiar voice. Gerard showed off his armor, as he had been appointed her personal escort at the grand banquet, and his confidence was impressive. Aika looked at him with admiration, amazed at how his armor emphasized his strength and grace, and immediately asked if he would really be her personal knight. Without wasting any time, Gerard leaned down and kissed her hand, promising to protect the young lady at any cost, even at the cost of his own life, causing a tremor in her heart. Aika was taken aback and asked in surprise why he had left his uncle, but Gerard smiled and assured her that other knights would accompany the Marquise, so there was no reason to worry. She sheepishly declared that he was the best, and Gerard, blushing slightly, thanked her for such a sincere assessment and devotion. Zenda looked closely at her brother, and was surprised to see that wearing a full set of armor without a war seemed strange, but he explained his choice as necessary. Gerard smiled and emphasized that his appointment as Aika's first personal knight required full preparation and a demonstration of strength, for which they received support from those around them. Zenda welcomed the appointment with joy, seeing how Gerard's loyalty and courage matched her niece's expectations, and Aika was happy to accept his loyalty. The girl thanked the knight for his service, feeling confident and protected. Zenda reminded that it was time to return to lessons, because before the banquet they needed to master etiquette. Aika was diligently preparing for the banquet. "Not forgetting about my teeth, I was glad that they had grown, and now my smile was not constrained, and every little thing seemed like part of the holiday. She visited a pavilion with exquisite dresses, tried on each one, admiring the fabric and style, realizing that her image at the banquet had to be perfect. The girl admitted that she felt especially cute in this outfit. The Marquise smiled, noticing her impatience and delight, and her heart fluttered at the upcoming event. When the uncle suddenly changed his expression, Aika froze because he looked more serious than usual, and the question about the knight Gerard made her slightly embarrassed. The Marquis asked whether his niece knew about the injury and how she realized that she needed to run to him. Aika, embarrassed, simply said that she heard the sound of a carriage. The young lady noticed her uncle's strange behavior. She felt a slight tremor, realizing that her words were only part of the truth, but her heart demanded honesty. She looked at her uncle with concern, realizing that he was more serious than ever. And after a brief moment of relief, she told him everything in detail, making sure that everything was okay with his hand. Aika breathed a sigh of relief, seeing that her uncle was his old self again. She realized that she would have to be more careful in the future, because the upcoming banquet required attention and concentration. She saw his serious look, but it did not give her any peace. He exhaled and declared that he understood everything. Then Aika quickly changed the subject. She felt relieved when she saw her former uncle. The day of the summer banquet that Aika had been waiting for had arrived. The girl trembled as she met her uncle's gaze, who asked with bewilderment why she was nervous before meeting new friends. Aika was looking forward to meeting her friends, but was upset by the ban on removing her nameplate, as she wanted to look beautiful, and the visible inscription interfered with her image. The girl prepared for the great event with impatience and excitement, realizing that every step, every smile, and every movement would create an impression about her future and position in society. The young lady took the first step and froze, amazed by the grandeur of the castle. The radiance of the towers and the wealth of the palace literally captured her attention. Soon she noticed her grandfather and, unable to contain her joy, threw herself into his arms, her face glowing with delight and anticipation of the holiday. The Marquise watched his father closely and declared that he had arrived just in time, and the Duke noted with a smile that this day was truly important for their princess. Embracing his granddaughter, the Duke suggested they go together, their footsteps filling the hall with a soft rustle, and every moment seemed festive and significant. The knight greeted them with a greeting, offering to accompany them, and his stern posture commanded respect, emphasizing the importance of the event. A moment later, the knight announced their family. The hall came to life. The gaze of all those present was directed at the young lady, as if she were a precious stone among luxury. The ladies, without hiding their curiosity, discussed the young lady who had been hidden for a long time, the whispers of their admiration filling the hall with quiet melodies of intrigue. Aika, embarrassed by the attention, wondered whether her friend would appear among the guests, because all eyes seemed to be holding her in the center of events. Suddenly, a familiar voice made her turn around. She saw the Count next to her friend. Her heart sped up and her eyes filled with joyful surprise. The Count smiled as he noticed how much the young lady had grown, and this recognition filled Aika with both pride and a little excitement. She hurried to her friend, not hiding her delight, and the Count, watching them, was surprised to note their closeness, because the children looked like truly kindred spirits. With one voice, they confirmed their connection, and the Count smiled, declaring that the dear children had not wasted their time, which further warmed the atmosphere of the meeting. He then inquired about the progress of the academy, and the young lady happily told how her grandfather had helped her carve her name into the stone, arranging the letters with care. The Count noted with a smile that everything was going smoothly at the academy, and their light conversation was filled with warmth, like a small island of calm in the midst of a luxurious ball. Attentive eyes were watching them, and the Marquis, assessing the situation, noticed suspicious people nearby. Realizing that urgent measures needed to be taken for the safety of his niece, his gaze darted around the room, as if assessing the threat, and his heart sank, because he realized that even on this solemn day, danger could hide under the mask of celebration. The Marquis approached the young lady's friend and quietly whispered something in his ear. Aika's gaze froze in surprise. She did not understand the meaning of the whisper. After a moment, the Count smiled and invited Aika to walk around the room to greet the other children, doing so with gentle care and warmth. The Marquis, standing nearby, informed his niece that he would keep an eye on her, and she could rest assured that she would feel safe even among the crowd of guests. The young lady had hardly had any friends before, and her heart was beating faster. She was worried, but she understood that she had to take a step and go herself. At the last moment, she looked at her friend, her eyes shining with slight anxiety and trust, and quietly asked him to come with her. Feeling support nearby, Eka looked at her friend with a tender smile and quietly thanked him for his support, because his presence gave her confidence and warmed her heart. A moment later, they were slowly moving through the hall, carefully passing the courtiers, whose glances kept sliding over the young lady, causing her a mixture of excitement and curiosity. Eka carefully watched everyone around her. They looked friendly, but her heart was beating anxiously because she was afraid that someone would refuse to meet her. Then, her faithful friend quietly reminded her that he was nearby, and the young lady felt relieved, because now she did not have to be afraid of loneliness.